Can't minimize workspace. All right, let's put you out of the way. Yeah. This guy's on.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third Affordable Housing Summit hosted by Community Action Lehigh Valley. Today, we gather not just as concerned citizens, but as warriors ready to fight for a cause that affects every corner of our community. We are honored to have a powerhouse of panelists who are not just leaders, but champions of change. Our keynote speaker and moderator will speak in just a bit. Let's give a warm welcome to Representative Josh Siegel of the 22nd Legislative District. Joining him today are Senator Nick Miller, a relentless advocate for our region, Sarah Satullo, the Deputy Director of Community Development for the City of Bethlehem, who tirelessly works to uplift our neighborhoods, Lynn Kirschenbaum, Senior Management Analyst and Regional Homeless Coordinator at HUD, an activist for those without homes, Jonathan Strauss, co-founder and developer at Cortex Residential, who is reshaping the landscape of our housing, Tiffany McDaniel from First Northern Bank and Trust, a lender who believes in the power of community, and Sam Del Rosario, he told me to roll my R's, but I can't, owner and associate broker at Keller Williams Real Estate, a true ally in our fight for affordable housing. I would like to extend a special thank you to Jean Hoffman, Housing Innovation Specialist and Case Manager at the 6th Street Shelter, who does her darndest to get our homeless participants into safe and affordable housing. Her job is not easy. She's developed relationships with many local landlords who trust her and therefore help our participants to transition from our shelter into apartments. Thank you, Jean. Friends, thank you. Friends, the size of our audience has grown since we first started these summits. This growth is a testament to our collective determination and the urgency of our mission. We are here because we believe that everyone deserves a safe and affordable place to call home. But let's face it, the challenges we face are daunting. Rents have skyrocketed, interest rates are out of control, and the price of purchasing a home has surged 30 to 40%. Families who work tirelessly to support themselves are being priced out of their own communities. This is unacceptable. We must do something. We must stand together and demand change. We must fight for policies that protect tenants, support first-time homebuyers, and ensure that affordable housing is a reality for all. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom has signed a suite of 31 affordable housing bills focused on cutting red tape and holding cities accountable for providing their fair share of housing. They call it the California Comeback Plan. I like that. And it includes $22 billion for housing and homelessness prevention. It's slated to lead to the creation of over 84,000 new housing units. This comprehensive strategy includes streamlining the building of new homes, breaking down barriers to affordable housing, addressing systemic bias by elevating the housing principles, and holding local governments accountable. These efforts are complemented by budget investments aimed at creating denser housing near jobs, parks, and schools, which are key to meeting both climate and affordability goals. Here in the Lehigh Valley, Representative Josh Siegel and Senator Nick Miller have focused on increasing the availability and accessibility of affordable housing in their respective areas. Representative Siegel helped to secure $1.95 million for affordable housing projects, including the rehabilitation of existing units and the development of new housing options. He proposed several bills aimed at changing zoning and construction codes to facilitate denser housing and repurposing abandoned properties. Senator Miller announced over $1.2 million in state funding for affordable housing projects in Northampton County and secured $1.4 million in low-income housing tax credits for a new housing project in Allentown. Today's entire panel have been champions in making inroads on this issue, and we are grateful for your contributions. So today, we are not just discussing problems, we are forging solutions. We are building a movement that will not rest until every family in the Lehigh Valley has a place to call home. So let's get fired up. Let's channel our frustration into action, our hope into determination, and our voices into a powerful chorus demanding justice. Together, we can and will make a difference. Thank you, and let's make this summit a turning point in our fight for affordable housing. I now turn it over to Jessica Reimer, Deputy Executive Director for Operations at Community Action. And just to give you a quick shout out to Jess, she was honored last night as one of the recipients of Lehigh Valley's 40 Under 40 Awards for dynamic young leader, being a dynamic young leader in our community. Jess.
Good morning. So I just want to do a little bit of a recap of what we've been doing for the last few summits. So for those of you who are new to the room, we introduced this whole summit concept at our annual meeting last November. We had requested for people who wanted to get involved to scan a QR code, send an email, get signed up. From that, we got some feedback on what everybody thought was important, which helped us structure our March summit. And from there, we had done surveys through Mentimeter, so it was a really engaging session. That helped us to break out what the short and long-term goals would be for the summits. What we did from there as a staff at Community Action, we analyzed all that information and highlighted what were the top short-term and long-term goals. So at the June summit, we then came back and did breakout groups and discussed those short and long-term goals. So with that, out of the short-term goals, the top 3 priorities are improving existing housing stock, create affordable and attainable units, and change local policies and ordinances and advocate. Whoop. So just as a reminder, our top short-term goals are the opportunities to improve existing units, redevelopment of those existing buildings, and vacant and underused retail centers, collaboration across jurisdictions, and maximizing public funding. And then long-term goals would be to rebuild public housing with a focus on mixed income sites with amenities and services, more funding for local municipalities, and change local ordinances to hold landlords accountable. So it's all of this feedback and information has come from the group of people that have been attending these summits for the past few months. So thank you to everybody who's been participating, and I appreciate all of those who are new to this summit because I know there's a few new people in the room. So we look forward to hearing from the panelists a little bit later on questions based around these goals. So next, I would like to turn it over to Representative Siegel to come up and talk about what he is doing in his district. Your sides are built in.
Oh, they're built in, perfect. And I obviously don't have a beard anymore, so that is still me, I promise. Thank you. I'm State Representative Josh Siegel. I represent the 22nd Legislative District, and for those of you that don't know, that's primarily Center City, Allentown, East Side, and parts of Salisbury Township. So I feel quite fortunate. I also represent one of the highest growth districts in the Lehigh Valley, where frankly we've seen tremendous amounts of revitalization and particularly market rate residential growth over the last decade. And I want to talk to you a little bit today about what I think are some promising state and local housing solutions to our housing affordability crisis. I believe truly and wholly that this represents a real existential crisis for the Lehigh Valley. I think in many ways we have become victims of our own success. And that has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. I think the secret is out. People have discovered the quality of life that the Lehigh Valley offers, and folks are flocking here from New York and New Jersey for what is a comparatively cheaper cost of living and cost of housing, and frankly, exacerbating housing prices for everyone, including long-term residents. Like I said, I want to talk a little bit first and foremost really about what we've done in Harrisburg and what I think are some promising state solutions to our affordable housing crisis, and how I think everyone in this room can be an effective advocate in pushing us as a local delegation to get those initiatives done. We all have power in this room to prevail upon our local representatives, our state representatives, our state senators, as well as advocating and organizing in Harrisburg. I'm a member of the PA Housing Choices Coalition, which is made up of a variety of housing advocates and supportive partners that actually, frankly, don't often have anything to do with housing. It's everybody from the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce, who views the housing shortage as a real impediment to workforce development and the ability to grow Pennsylvania's economy, all the way down to affordable housing builders in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, who are genuinely concerned about the tremendous just paucity of extremely low income affordable housing that we're seeing across the Commonwealth. And so I really actually want to start by pointing out that what we're feeling here in the Lehigh Valley and what we're feeling really in the Commonwealth is actually a global phenomenon. And frankly, housing is, I believe, the defining issue of our time. And it stems from, frankly, decades of underbuilding. Many of you probably know that, and this is probably not a massive or a new fact, but for decades we've underbuilt across the world. Certainly the 2008 financial crisis did not help. It shrunk markets. It made it harder for developers to build. But what we're seeing is, and I think many of us get that palatable sense across our communities, a fundamental sense of folks surviving and not thriving. And so much of that emanates from the exorbitant cost of housing. And so we have here around the world, amongst the OECD average, nearly 50% of people in OECD countries are deeply dissatisfied with housing affordability. And here in the United States, it remains the second largest domestic concern for all families. After high cost of living and inflation, it's the cost of renting or owning a home. I would argue those probably go hand in hand. Obviously, inflation has been primarily driven by housing costs. It's the largest component of the CPI. And then I think most calamitously is particularly for younger folks. I just bought my house last November with my wife, so I'm 30 years old. And for, I think, the next generation of Pennsylvanians, we are locking folks out of the best way to accumulate wealth in our community, which is homeownership. It's such a critical component of the American dream. And if you look at the top concerns amongst younger folks, and one of the great things about the Lehigh Valley is while the rest of the Commonwealth is struggling to retain population shrinking, our under 40 demographic is actually growing quite sustainably. But we are in danger of pricing those folks, those young people out who are coming to the Lehigh Valley for opportunity. And as you can see here, for folks in that core young demographic, graduating high school and trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives, housing is one of their top concerns, second only to healthcare and again inflation, which I would argue in this way are very much commingled. So I think again we have an existential dilemma in our Commonwealth, our country, and specifically here in the Valley. We are putting one of the biggest downward deflationary pressures on folks across all income spectrums, and it's a multi-generational crisis. As a representative, the biggest thing we do is constituent service. The biggest thing we do is people walking into our office and asking for help. And to be frank, the biggest obstacle we face is that most of the folks asking for help in the Lehigh Valley, there are such limited resources. And many of the folks can attest to that in this room, that we are trying to help so many people with so little resources that sometimes there's just nowhere for folks to go. We have an absence of emergency housing, an absence of rapid rehousing, and it complicates all these other laudable goals that we work on as partners, right? Reentry from the criminal justice system, helping women escape domestic abuse situations. The problem is transitional housing often becomes permanent housing because there's no affordable apartments or homes to offload those folks to when they leave a program. And it's one of the most heart-wrenching aspects of my service as a state representative is this inability to truly offer a solution to everybody who comes into my office and asks for help. And I admire all the work that everyone in the room does because we are really fighting against an uphill battle here. And it's one, I think, defined by an absence of resources. And I think everybody here does the most they can with the least amount that they frankly can cobble together. And that's not a reflection on you. It's a reflection on the fact that as a society, we have not valued the issue of housing enough for a very long time. So by national estimates, we're probably somewhere between 4 to 7 million housing units short. It really depends on the methodology you want to consult. Just yesterday, you may have seen Governor Shapiro was in Philadelphia, where he was signing an executive order to direct the state to develop a 10-year plan for building a sufficient supply of housing. By conservative estimates, the Commonwealth itself is 100,000 housing units short. That's generally considered a lower estimate. I've heard estimates of 200,000 plus housing units short Commonwealth-wide. So just a tremendous supply and demand imbalance across all income spectrums. And then here in the Lehigh Valley, we've probably heard this offhand quoted many times in the media, but we're about 9,000 housing units short in terms of the mismatch between inventory and demand. And that number grows by about 1,300 every year. And again, mind you, that shortage was occurring before the pandemic. It's been exacerbated. And the population projections that the Lehigh Valley anticipates, right, 100,000 additional residents by 2050, I think those projections are probably off in an undersense. I think we're probably going to experience additional population growth as more and more folks choose to leave high density, high cost areas. And in an era of remote work where you don't have to live in close proximity to New York or Philadelphia anymore because you're working from home half the time, I really think the Lehigh Valley needs to get ahead of this housing dilemma and expeditiously, because I think the market forces that have made the Valley a place where affordability has become a crisis, that's only going to get worse as more and more folks respond to that work from home dynamic. And then, as many of you have probably seen, the Planning Commission has pointed out that there is a chronic shortage of housing, mind you, at all income spectrums, right? There's a shortage of market rate housing, and there's a shortage of deeply affordable housing. And obviously, we're here today to talk primarily about the shortage of extremely low income and working class housing, workforce housing. But it's important to acknowledge that we have a housing crisis defined by a shortage at all income spectrums. And the reason that that matters is because we know that when there's a shortage of market rate houses, those folks will bid down on houses that are otherwise affordable to working class folks. And the filtering process is a critical component of making sure that we don't price people out of our housing market. You consider two families, one making $30,000 a year and another making $200,000 a year. And if a comparatively affordable home comes on the market, the family that has $200,000 a year is likely going to outbid them. They're going to buy that house that would be otherwise affordable, and they're going to push that family further down. So I think that gets lost in the conversation around the housing crisis is that if we don't often build enough market rate housing, we also cannot satisfy our desire to build enough affordable housing because we will continue to have a downward impact. Now, before I get to some of the solutions, I actually want to, this is a fascinating study that came out a few years ago by Chang Kishesh and Enrico Moretti, who are two really talented economists. And it actually put into perspective the human, social, and economic consequences of not building enough housing, right? And we often just think about it in terms of a roof over your head. But we often forget that without a house, you also don't have access to the opportunity, right? The idea is being able to live near a decent job market, live near a decent job that pays a sustainable wage, live in an area with a good school. All of that is contingent on your ability to find shelter. And so in 2014, these two economists did a study where they looked at what they called spatial misallocation, which is basically people not really living where they could otherwise live if housing costs were much more affordable, right? And so when we think of like the most productive cities in the country, San Francisco, New York, San Jose, high wages, high productivity, but guess what? They also have really restrictive land use policies. San Francisco is a really great example. It's an extraordinarily wealthy city, lots of great jobs, higher wages than the cities that surround them. 75% of it is owned single family. So there's a tremendous amount of people being locked out of the ability to move into areas where they could otherwise earn greater money. And so what these two economists looked at is what would happen if our superstar cities, our most productive places, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, were much more lenient about the way that they choose to build housing, much more welcoming of a variety of housing stocks to allow those folks to relocate to those high wage, high productivity cities. And what they found was that if those cities had had a sort of median level of zoning permissibility, our GDP would actually be $2 trillion larger. And the average family would make $8,700 more a year. And so I think we often forget in the conversation around housing that when we're not building enough housing, we're creating a whole host of other consequences for our families. The further away people have to drive to find a job, the further away we push people from opportunity, the more damage we do to our families. We deny them better wages, which can in turn help them raise their family and make sure that their kids have the resources that they need. We push them further and further away from the kind of jobs we want them to hold. So I thought this was a really interesting thought exercise. Now, the funny thing about the study, obviously, is that it's entirely hypothetical. In their study, basically, they assume everyone moves to San Jose, San Francisco, and New York, which is never going to happen. If anybody's ever seen Judge Dredd, I'm a sci-fi nerd. We're not all going to live in megapolises, but it is an interesting thought exercise. And so, again, one of the things we have to realize here in the Lehigh Valley is that we actually have a tremendous obligation to be a source of opportunity and economic mobility. Because one of the things I take great pride in is that the Lehigh Valley is one of the largest metro areas in the country. And one of the reasons they looked at metro areas is because these are our economic powerhouses, right? We are growing in the Lehigh Valley. We're doing very well in terms of job creation. But when we lock people out, we don't do our part to make sure that we accommodate new opportunities, new job opportunities, and new growth. And then, of course, the human consequence of what we've seen in the Lehigh Valley, we know quite well, right? Nationwide, 50% of renters are cost burdened. It's 21 million renter households. And then here in the Valley, we know that nearly 60% of renters spend more than 30% of their income on rent, and 20% of homeowners, mind you, I think is also an extraordinary statistic. We often think of rent burden only in the sense of you renting, or cost burden in renting. But I think it's insane because I think we generally think of when you buy a home, you're probably at some degree of financial stability. You've saved, you're at a certain point in your life. But nearly 1 in 5 people that own a home here in the Lehigh Valley are cost burdened. And that, to me, is even more alarming because the whole idea is homeownership is, I think, a quintessential part of the American dream. And we've literally made that so difficult that 1 in 5 families is struggling to pay their mortgage. And I think many of us in this room want as many people as possible to be able to access that opportunity to become a homeowner, to build that generational wealth and that equity. But we're creating an environment where even the idea of homeownership becomes a financial burden and a financial risk for families. And then I used to work for the county. I spent 5 years at the county. One of the things when I worked for the controller, is we raised the alarm on the eviction crisis. And this was something that was happening prior to the pandemic. It's obviously gotten much worse, but Lehigh County is unfortunately a leader in evictions statewide. We're double the state average. 14 and 100 renters in the Lehigh Valley is in danger of facing eviction. And then as we talk about reducing homelessness, we know that there's a strong correlation between increases in rent costs and increases in folks experiencing an unsheltered situation. So for every 50% increase in house prices, you get an 11% increase in the size of your homeless population. So the more inflationary housing becomes, the more likely we are to simply just displace people because, as we know, the Alice population in the Lehigh Valley is growing quite considerably. Folks are one emergency away from losing their apartment or potentially losing their home. And by all accounts, housing costs, those inflationary costs, account for about 61% of the reason that people experience homelessness. The next biggest cause after that is loss of a job, which intuitively makes a great deal of sense. But in general, the more expensive and the more rapid the cost of housing rises, the more likely we all are to see more people become homeless, experience displacement. So Pennsylvania has not been inert. We've done a lot of great stuff in the legislature to try to address the housing affordability crisis. Senator Miller will be here later, and he's been a tremendous advocate for whole home repairs. I'm sure all of you are familiar with whole home repairs. It's a phenomenal program. We funded it with American Rescue Plan dollars 2 years ago. Again, that was a one-time expenditure because we got dollars from the federal government. We have consistently in the legislature, many of us have advocated to make it an annual line item. The governor has consistently put this program in his budget. Unfortunately, it has not made it through the budget proceedings. And it's disappointing because we know that one of the most important ways of making sure there's affordable housing is just preserving what we have, not losing the existing stock of housing as it is. And whole home repairs was an incredible component of that. Especially for working class and low-income households, utility costs, energy costs, weatherization. These are things that, low-income families spend 3 times as much on their utility and electric bills as a middle-class family. And it's often because they live in homes that are not properly weatherized, that don't contain heat or air well. And so whole home repairs was a really innovative and transformative program that we implemented here in the Commonwealth. It was actually the brainchild of Senator Siegel, who's from Philadelphia. and the need, obviously, as everyone in this room, well outstripped the meager funding that we could put towards it. But it is my hope that we will make this contribution again in future budget proceedings, because it was wildly successful. Everybody from seniors to working class folks applied, and it's up to $50,000 per homeowner. For those of you who don't know, whole home repairs was very generous, and folks took advantage of it. On top of that, we raised fair funding. So our housing affordability fund at the state is funded through a percentage of the realtor transfer tax statewide. That had been capped for years. We raised that cap this year. So through 2026, it'll eventually rise to $100 million a year. Still a drop in the bucket in terms of the total need to build affordable housing in the Commonwealth. But it represents almost a doubling of what our previous fair contribution was. So that's a considerable amount of money from the Commonwealth. I think it represents a historic investment. And then on the housing insecurity side, I was very proud this year that we added additional money to the social safety net associated with housing. So this year we funded a $2.5 million right to counsel program to help local municipalities provide right to counsel. I've been a big believer that right to counsel is no different than the public defender system. You get in trouble with the criminal justice system and you can't afford an attorney to navigate that system. We assign someone to make sure that you have a representative in that courtroom. But when you go through eviction proceedings, the majority of folks going through eviction proceedings have no legal representation, and they're very, very likely to lose. Philadelphia has what is considered sort of a national standard for its eviction diversion program. And by the way, as most times we are in public policy, we are, pound wise or penny wise and pound foolish. Their program was estimated to save the city $45 million a year by reducing court costs, by reducing the need for rapid rehousing funding. And what they also found was that when a tenant was not represented, they only won about 7% of the time in court proceedings. When they were represented, they prevailed about 90% of the time. That is truly, I think, an alarming dichotomy. And it really shows how, frankly, unjust we've been to people that have likely fallen on hard times, right? If you're going through an eviction proceeding, more often than not, it's because you've experienced some sort of financial crisis. You got sick, you lost your job, your car broke and you needed to fix your car so you could get to work. You chose to pick your immediate financial well-being over, the rent for that month. Right to counsel is a critical component of that. The Commonwealth has finally made that a part of its statewide priorities. I hope that this line item grows every year. Obviously, that $2.5 million is being dispersed across nonprofits across the Commonwealth. But I believe that right to counsel is no different than our public defender system. It is a critical component of justice in our criminal justice system. And it's also important to making sure that we help folks navigate that eviction process. And more often than not, in the Philadelphia eviction diversion program, they negotiate payment plans. They find ways to keep those tenants from getting evicted and staying in the place where they already live. And I think that that's a win for everybody. And then we also allocated $2.5 million to our local emergency housing fund, which is intended to help communities do rapid rehousing, help those folks who have unfortunately experienced displacement. Now, I really do want to talk about solutions, because that's why we're here. And I agree, we're here to try to forge a path forward from both a state perspective and a local perspective. And I have certainly been a leader in Harrisburg. I have definitely been the one advocating for zoning reform. So I have been a source of consternation for some and excitement for others. The local township officials do not like me, unfortunately. So you can't make everybody happy. But look, zoning reform, I think, is one of the best ways that we can address the affordability crisis. One of the primary factors driving the lack of affordability is that real imbalance between supply and demand, and also the types of housing that we build, mind you. So one of the best things we can do is re-legalize missing middle housing. So if anybody's familiar with missing middle housing, it's that middle ground between a traditional single family home and a larger multifamily housing complex. It's your duplexes, it's your tris, it's your quads, it's your stacked multiplex. This housing was really legal in the United States for a very long time. If you look at older pictures of Detroit and Boston and Cleveland, the downtowns looked very different. The neighborhoods looked very different. They weren't large single family homes. They were duplexes and triplexes. Neighborhoods were much more walkable and much more dense. And unfortunately, the prevailing zoning orthodoxy for decades has been to zone those types of properties out in favor of sort of larger single family homes. We do have a deeply exclusionary zoning, really across the country and certainly here in the Commonwealth. So I have been an author of a number of bills that would legalize duplexes, triplexes, and quads in areas that are zoned single family. Because one of the things we need to do is accommodate additional growth in the places where people want to live. And unfortunately, the places where people often want to live have some of the most tightly restricted zoning laws that make it impossible to build. And I often think of, the best school districts we have in the Valley, Parkland, Emmaus, a lot of those neighborhoods, if you drive around, you're going to find traditional suburban subdevelopments. You're going to find a lot of traditional sort of larger single family homes. You're not going to see the denser walkable neighborhoods. And so I have been an author of that. I've been an author of making sure that we convert old office space that is no longer in use to residential uses. Post-COVID, we know there's a tremendous vacancy in our office space. Well, one of the best things we can do is repurpose those offices and those vacant buildings into housing by cutting the red tape and sort of clearing some of those regulatory hurdles, right? Anyone will tell you that one of the biggest cost barriers for building housing is that regulatory period, that time it takes to get a project from proposal to shovel ready. We've got to make it easier to build, easier to get things and projects off the ground. And zoning is one of those deeply artificial restrictions. And so while I've authored legislation, there's other things the Commonwealth really needs to explore as well. And the AARP has been a huge advocate for missing middle housing because they want to make sure seniors can age in place, right? This is a multi-generational crisis, and we want to make sure that seniors can downsize to smaller homes. One of the biggest issues now, especially in the Lehigh Valley, is a lot of older residents are kind of locked into their larger homes that they may have bought 30, 40 years ago. They'd like to downsize. They'd like to vacate their older home, which would open up some more affordable housing stock, but they can't find an affordable apartment or a smaller home to downsize to, which would so they're going to put themselves in financial jeopardy. So they stay put in an older house that probably is too big for them to maintain, probably well more than they need at this point. So Oregon has been very successful at creating a sort of statewide approach to this. So they passed HB 2001, which directed communities of a certain size to accommodate different types of housing. They basically gave these municipalities model ordinances and said, this is a best practice. This is how you can do your part to absorb additional growth, how you can accommodate new folks in your community, and how you can stop shutting the door on different types of housing. Been very successful at getting communities, their cutoff was 25,000 or above. So again, larger municipalities, but the idea was we need to get communities to think critically about their part in resolving the affordable housing crisis, because we can't build our way out of it if we've legally made it impossible to build. And frankly, zoning has been one of the primary factors in why our housing stock has not kept pace with demand, and also why we can't provide the type of housing that people want to live in. The smaller modular units, the value of a duplex or a triplex is that you can spread the cost of your development over more units. You can offer cheaper unit costs. Imagine if you're buying a lot, you can choose one home that you can offer at $400,000 a year. You could potentially put 4 homes on one lot, and you could offer them at a much cheaper rate. And that's how you make starter homes available to young people. It's how you help seniors downsize. And it's also how we build the kind of communities we want. Walkable, opportunity, amenity rich, less automobile dependent, more access to public transit. And so I think one of the things we have to get people to realize is that we have lost our way with housing, and everyone in this room can be an advocate for that missing middle housing. And I'll get to that with our local solutions, but missing middle housing is a critical component of us addressing not just the affordability crisis, but making sure that we have housing that from a demographic perspective, younger generations want and younger generations desire, but also all of the other things and residual benefits associated with building this housing, creating more sustainable and environmentally friendly communities, more efficient use of our space. Everybody here wants to preserve farmland and wants to maintain the quality of life in the Lehigh Valley, is almost certainly sick and tired of seeing warehouses pop up everywhere. We want to make sure that we maintain the things that make the Lehigh Valley special. And there's only so much space that we can build on. We have to be very judicious, very efficient with the way we use our land. And so making sure that we responsibly densify that land, we put more people in those spaces, and we make use of the limited land that we have is one of the only ways we're going to be able to satisfy all the demand to live in the Lehigh Valley. And this is the thing that I always think is most interesting is, like, we think of our cities, right? We think of our biggest cities as like places of density, right? Anybody's ever been to Boston or New York or San Francisco, massive downtown, 40-story skyscrapers. But really, those cities are predominantly single family. San Francisco is 3/4 of it is single family, right? So you can imagine the arbitrary restriction that places on your ability to build when you basically say, you know, these neighborhoods can't expand, they can't grow, they can't accommodate even the smallest type of housing stock. You make it almost inevitable that prices will go up. You make it a certainty that you will make your market unaffordable. So this is an idea of like what missing middle looks like, right? Because I think there's often a sense of consternation, right? I've certainly heard when I've been pushing for this type of housing that you'll ruin the character of neighborhoods and you'll sort of destroy the quality of life and you'll change the type of community I live in. And the reality is this type of housing seamlessly blends in with neighborhoods. It's very aesthetically pleasing. It's very mindful. It's very demure. If anybody's been watching TikTok, there we go. It's very, very it's high quality housing. And it allows us to make sure that more families can live in the types of communities they want to live in the school districts that give their kids a good education near the jobs that they need. This is a duplex from Minneapolis, right? I mean, you could mistake it for a single family home. Might just look like a 3-story house. This is a stacked triplex, right? Beautiful. I mean, it doesn't destroy the character of a neighborhood. It's fairly indistinguishable. I mean, honestly, walking by it, you might just assume they really like balconies on their house and somebody built a giant home. This is a 4-plex. This is one of my favorite examples. This to me looks no different than some of the houses I see in West End, Allentown. Walking by that house, you'd never know that there were four families living in it. There were 4 home ownership opportunities in there. This is a 4-plex. And these are, you know, townhouses. These are probably the one we're more accustomed to seeing in the Lehigh Valley because it's the one type of missing middle housing we have sort of built inadvertently or organically. But I think we have a real responsibility in this room because part of what we have to do is change the paradigm, change the mindset, and change public perception. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of angst about what it means to accommodate growth, what it means to change your zoning, what it means to accommodate different types of housing stock. And I don't want to reduce it to YIMBY versus NIMBY, but it is really about a perception that anytime you accommodate new growth, it wrecks your community and that, you know, we are full, right? That's often what people say at meetings. I'm a former city council person. And there's always this underlying context that we're full. We can't fit any more people. Like the city's too built. There's no more room. And that's not true, right? And we have a responsibility to be the emissaries of that message, to be the visionaries who can see what's possible. I always say there's always a constituency not to build more housing, right? It's easy. Those people already lived there. There is no constituency right now for new housing, right? There's never people that show up and say, yes, please build this. Yes, we need light. Yes, change the zoning. Yes, accommodate more growth. Yes, add these housing stocks, right? Meetings are always full when there's a rezoning of people that say no. There needs to be a group of people that are willing to stand up and say, yes, with open arms, we can welcome more people. We can provide opportunity. We can welcome folks to our community in a way that makes us all better off, all wealthier, all richer, all safer, all sounder. Other opportunities, and this is critically important for anybody who's on the building side of things, right? I was talking before this started, and everybody wants to pretend that there's some sort of silver bullet to the affordable housing crisis that doesn't cost money, right? We all wish that we could just like wave a wand, but the reality is that this does come down to dollars and cents, right? Cost money to build housing. It is the most expensive, one of the most expensive crises we face. And there are a couple of states that have done a really good job at investing in the financing component. So red state, blue state is again bipartisan. What I love about housing is it's brought everybody together because I think it is such a quintessential part of what we associate with making it in this country and getting a little piece of opportunity. So Utah created a $300 million loan fund for housing developers to provide no interest or low interest loans to help them build starter homes, right? So, you know, developer comes in, wants to build a subdivision. The state of Utah will help subsidize some of that development, provided that some of those houses are available at a cheaper rate, that they're available at a below market rate, that they're available at a starter home rate. Oregon did the same thing. And the value of this funding is that it provides that critical bridge funding, right? It fills the capital stack. And it also makes sure that as a state, we're not really waiting on federal funds, right? The more nimble and the more efficient we can be at providing that bridge funding and that gap financing, we can try to make sure that we can respond to crises faster, right? Because it takes a very long time to get LIHTC, as I'm sure anybody in this room understands. It's a cumbersome, it's a deeply complicated process. There's no guarantee you'll get the funding. And it takes a while for a project to come to fruition as we wait on that funding. And so if we can layer in a state-supported financing initiative to make up some of that difference. We can layer in a low-interest bridge loan. We can help speed up the process of building housing, and we can get those critical starter homes. And we know that the median house price in the Lehigh Valley is $350,000 plus, right? That's not a starter home for the average person. And then the other component is tax abatements, right? So if you don't want to do a direct expenditure, one of the other ways we can make projects pencil out is to make sure that at least in the short or long term, there's no property tax liability. And one of the best examples of this is the state of New York. So for several decades, the state of New York had what was called 421A. So it was a 10 to 25-year tax abatement that generally gradually phased out. That expired, but Governor Kathy Hochul this last year renewed the program and created something called 485X. It's an up to 40-year property tax abatement, provided that at least 25% of the housing that's built in those developments is set aside at affordable, which they define as obviously between 60 and 80% of AMI. What I love about this is that it acknowledges the market realities of building. It recognizes that projects have to pencil out for developers or they're simply not going to work. And it realizes that that window sometimes has to be long. Predictability is hugely important when it comes to building affordable housing. Developers need to know they've got a long enough time that they can recoup their costs. Between 2000 and 2010, 60% of all the housing built in the city of New York was built because of the 421A tax abatement. And a significant portion of that was affordable. Developers in New York will tell you housing doesn't get built in those high cost markets unless there is some sort of public sector component. And that's the frank reality, right? We have to be specific about those solutions. And we have to be honest with ourselves, with our constituents, and with our communities that there is a cost to this. And whether it's direct or indirect, we have to pay at some point to make these projects a reality. And it's not cheap. Cost the city of New York about $1.7 billion last year. But again, everything is an opportunity cost, and it's a matter of what we value here, right? If we say we care about people having shelter, having a sense of stability, if we believe that a home is the epicenter of every other source of success we want for people in their lives, kids can't learn when they're worried about where they're going to come home to, or if they're even going to have a roof over their head. Parents can't go to work and be productive if they have endless anxiety about whether or not they're going to have a home to take care of themselves and their family in. If we really believe housing is that important, we have to put our money where our mouth is. I believe budgets are moral documents. They are an they're an expression of your values in dollars and cents. And this is no different. And the value of these tax abatements is nobody's losing any revenue. It's only on property tax improvements or improvements in value. And what I'm particularly proud about New York for doing is that they've attached labor standards to all of those tax abatements, because I'm not a big believer in giving away tax abatements for nothing in return. And it's not just affordability components. They make sure that when those houses are built, it's using union labor, it's using local labor, so that folks benefit directly, so that we also make sure that families in the area can access living wages and earn good jobs. So that tax abatement program in New York specifically requires labor to be used on those jobs, because if we're going to hand out something that generous, there needs to be some stipulation and standards attached to it. And we want to make sure that we create pipelines to opportunity for folks in our own community, and not also, you don't build affordable housing by also making sure the people that build that housing can't afford to live, right? There's something inherently unjust and wrong about that. And then also New Jersey is famous for what it's called its pilot program, which is about a 30-year property tax abatement. We can't do that here. I actually tried to do this in Pennsylvania. I introduced legislation. It turns out our uniformity clause, as usual, ruins everything. The uniformity clause in Pennsylvania sucks. For those of you who don't know, it basically says we can't have a graduated income tax, so everyone has to pay the same income tax. It's awful, and it ruined this proposal. But the pilot program in New Jersey has also been used to considerable success, and it's not all that indistinguishable from what's done in New York. It's a 30-year tax abatement. And Jersey City has actually recently used this with considerable success to build housing. And so this is the Bayfront property in Jersey City. It's an old industrial parcel. It's about 100 acres. So it's currently vacant, right? Or it was vacant. Developer came in and said, I want to build. City of Jersey City said, not unless you do affordable housing. They said, okay, fine. But we need something that can help make it pencil out. So they offered a 30-year pilot on this project in exchange for 35% of all the residential units being set aside as affordable. They're going to put up to 10,000 residential units on this parcel. So you do the math, 35% of that, that's a considerable amount of affordable units in a city like Jersey City that's very expensive. And what I'm also proud about is that project will be governed by a PLA. So in the city, Not only are we building affordable housing, but we're making sure that local laborers get a chance to also earn a living wage on that project. This is what it's going to look like when it's done. That's an incredible and I think resounding victory for a city. Look at that. I mean, it's beautiful. You're taking a blighted parcel and you're creating a vibrant, walkable, mixed-use community. And what I'm particularly proud about with this project is it breaks this notion or stigma that affordable housing somehow should lack the amenities and the resources that market rate housing has, right? There's this belief that affordable housing is supposed to be subpar, second tier, or class C. It's not supposed to have the same kitchen and appliances and amenities. And that's an unfortunate stigma that our society has created. And this is the kind of vibrant mixed use community we should all want to build. Well, mixed income, working class with wealthy, green space, parks, access to public amenities. This is a real victory, and I think a real testament to what happens when the public sector steps up and helps make projects pencil out. This doesn't happen unless you have a generous abatement. Some additional things the state can do: we can help convert office space into housing. My legislation does that, but we also need to help pay for it, especially for cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, where their vacancy rates are something like 60% in their offices. It's going to bankrupt their cities, and it's going to hurt their school districts. It's going to hurt their ability to provide public services. But those office towers, they were not built for residential, right? A lot of these buildings were built in the 1980s, the 1970s. I know I say that like it's an eons ago. I was not alive. But they were not built with residential in mind. And they often have very limited square footage and floor surface area that you can actually repurpose it in a way that makes it cost effective. The other thing we can do is repurpose gray fields. How many people drive around and look at old abandoned shopping plazas or shopping malls in the state and go, God, that looks awful. We know that post-COVID, e-commerce has really played a huge role in the downturn of traditional retail. We need to repurpose those gray fields and turn them into, vibrant mixed-use parcels. I authored legislation this year that would have created local enabling legislation that would allow municipalities to offer tax abatements for the redevelopment of shopping plazas and shopping malls and older industrial sites. The best example I think of is the Whitehall Mall. The Whitehall Mall has certainly seen better days. It's adjacent to a much more successful commercial property. It's also along a transit corridor. And if you look at the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission's Vision 2030, they specifically look at that parcel as an opportunity for what they call transit hub development, an opportunity to put lots of folks and jobs and opportunity on a core corridor. Also transit-oriented development, right? Building high-density housing along our bus routes and our train routes, making sure people are less dependent on automobiles, less dependent on driving, and then permitting reform. This is a nuanced, sort of archaic one. It's not the sexiest type of reform, but it takes entirely too long in the state of Pennsylvania to get things built. It slows projects down. And we did a little pilot permitting reform this year with DEP. But I think we need to expand that to residential properties. We have to clear the red tape. We have to make it easier to build, because the longer it takes a project to get off the ground, the more likely those costs are going to be passed on to those units when it eventually comes to fruition. And you know what the good news is, folks? This is my favorite one. People are on our side. I think this is housing is a super contentious issue when it shouldn't be, and it's because it runs into people's greatest sensitivity, right? Which is their sense of place, their sense of where they live, their sense of who they are. But you know what the truth is? There's broad consensus, and the types of things that we're talking about, the types of solutions the state of Pennsylvania and the types of solutions we need to do here locally, people overwhelmingly support by large margins. And that should give us not just a sense of courage, but a little giddy in our step. Should tell us we got to get out there and get to work, because we're on the right side of this issue. People are waiting for solutions, and when you put those solutions forward, they're going to have your back. I think there's this fear that whenever new housing is proposed, it's often the loudest voices in the room that step up and say no. But they're a very vocal minority that do not reflect what the majority of people understand, which is that we need to build more housing and create more opportunity. And this is just an example, and it's super small because I ripped this off a website through snipping, which was not easy. But what it basically just says is broad majorities. We're talking 50–60% of people supporting things from streamlining the housing approval process, allowing small multifamily on residential lots, majority support. And I think that's incredible. It shows to me that across the board, people of all walks of life understand intuitively something is broken. The status quo is not working. We have to do something different. And I've always believed that leadership is not about the low-hanging fruit, and it's not about the path of least resistance. It's about doing the hard things. It's about putting forth solutions that don't come to fruition overnight. that don't necessarily, that don't start with 90% consensus. Leadership is not doing what everyone already agrees on. It is doing the things that will actually move society forward and that take a little bit of effort, a little bit of persuasion, a little bit of work. But this shows that if we put in the work, the people are with us. And I'm going to end with this, just some local solutions, because I also want to make it clear that I actually believe that local government has a huge role to play in this. And I actually think in many cases, local government is partly the reason that we got here. Local control, restrictive zoning, land use is broken the way that we build housing. And I think there's some really great things that local communities can do to expedite the process. One of my favorite innovations is objective design standards or pre-approved sort of building designs. So cities like Sacramento and Detroit have kind of pioneered these. So developer comes in, says, I want to build, duplex, triplex, rather than leaving it up to subjective review, rather than leaving it up to a back and forth process with volunteer boards. The city provides basically a pick your own play kind of model. They'll have a book of variations of architectural designs. The developer just picks one. It's pre-approved. So they eliminate a lot of the red tape, a lot of the design process, a lot of the back and forth hurdle that slows down the process. And those objective design standards ensure that the city is doing its part to make sure that the housing at least kind of looks like the neighborhood that it's being built in. We're not just plopping a random building down, but it gives the developer a sense of predictability. And this is something we can do that's in our own hands. We don't have to wait on Harrisburg or the federal government to take any action. We can codify something like that into law now. Reviewing the local zoning code is critical. Mark Hartney is here, or was there? He is getting coffee. I got to commend the city of Allentown and the Community Economic Development Office in Allentown under Vicki Kistler and Mark Hartney, who have led our historic rezoning initiative. Allentown is switching to a form-based code system. But through that rezoning process, we are finding ways to accommodate the types of housing stock I talked about here, missing middle, that variety of housing stock that we need to accommodate new growth. We are changing a lot of our neighborhoods to welcome and accommodate greater density. And we've got to not be afraid of that word density. And I commend the city of Allentown for taking that step because it is going to be a critical part of that solution. And every community can do that by taking a hard look at their zoning. I know the city of Bethlehem has a very comprehensive open door strategy that's taking a look at that as well. This is something that's within our power, something that we can prevail upon our own folks to do, right? We don't have to change a lot of minds. And the best thing is it's very easy to get access to our local officials. It's not hard to get a meeting with the mayor or your city council. You can make those changes in a fairly expeditious fashion. Also expediting the local permitting process, creating a one-stop shop permitting office, making it quicker and predictable for developers to build. Washington State is actually looking at eliminating the design review process altogether and just create an administrative design review where city officials will be the final sign off and you remove some of those volunteer boards. And then the other thing is, the most important thing once again is putting our money where our mouth is. And that means we do need dedicated funding sources at the local level to make sure that we can finance these projects. Asher's here from the realtors. I'm going to give him a little heartburn, but also we've had this conversation. The city of Allentown is looking at the realtor transfer tax right now, right? I think as it stands, putting it in the budget as a black hole doesn't do any good. But I think you could make the case that raising taxes a smidge to create a dedicated funding stream specifically for housing is something people would get behind. And it's because it would provide our communities with local flexibility. Let me give you a great example. The county of Northampton right now is partnering with Habitat for Humanity to build affordable housing in Forks Township. They're applying for a $500,000 gaming grant. Imagine if each of our counties and each of our municipalities just had its own dedicated revenue stream that was large enough that we could make those financing initiatives without having to go out and apply for a grant. Imagine, if you will, that Allentown and Lehigh and Northampton have their own housing fund that is much more robust, that has a significant and sizable dedicated source of revenue where we can act as the grantee, where we can act as the bridge financing. They're going to build 25 units of affordable housing in Forks Township, homeownership opportunities through Habitat for Humanity. We have to step up and again, provide those solutions. And I'm a big believer that there's nothing wrong with asking for more money so long as you have a solution and a plan for it. And I think the city of Allentown has an opportunity perhaps to dedicate any potential increase in revenue specifically to affordable housing and attainable housing here in the Valley. When I was in Allentown Council, we created a land bank, but the biggest deficiency that the land bank had is that it had no dedicated source of revenue. So a land bank doesn't do much good if it can't procure any properties or actually take parcels and repurpose them. It's basically exists in name only. And that frankly was, I think, a slap in the face to people. We created it and it largely has been ineffective and deficient without like a dedicated revenue source. And that's all. So I apologize for being so long-winded, but this is my my passion. And I look forward to moderating this panel discussion and working with all of you because I do believe this is the existential crisis of our time here in the Valley. And we have two paths forward. We either become deeply cost prohibitive, like Northern New Jersey, where every home is $700,000 and families just can't get by, or we can really be a land of opportunity where families of all walks of life, all generations can live in the same neighborhoods with the same amenities without good opportunity. And we really do have the power in our hands to fix it. So thank you.
So at this time, I would like to call our panelists up to get themselves comfortable in the chairs up front. But also I want to invite everybody else in the room to take this opportunity to grab coffee, water, snacks, bathroom break, while everybody kind of gets settled down.
Toggles on. And if you want to mute it again. You can just toggle it on and then we can talk.
Yes.
That answers my question. There was one seat left and I was like, maybe we put him to the side.
All right, everyone. We are going to get started with our panel discussion. So if everybody could just get themselves seated, I would greatly appreciate that. All right. we're going to have their pictures up on the screens just so that everybody in the audience knows who each person is. So thank you to Lynn Kirschenbaum, Tiffany McDaniel, Senator Miller, Sam Del Rosario, Sarah Sotula, and Jonathan Strauss for being here today to be our panelists. So I will turn it over to Representative Siegel. He has a whole bunch of questions to ask each of our panelists. So sit back and enjoy. And then after this, we will allow for some questions from the group as well. Yep.
All right. Well, there's no curveballs because they told me what to ask you. So, why did you do this? No. I'm going to start with my friend and my colleague in the Senate, Senator Miller. We worked together on housing for a while. You've been a tremendous advocate. How do you think we can better coordinate spending across different levels of government to make sure that we're not duplicating services and we're ultimately working together in a cohesive fashion?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me this morning. Housing, obviously, a very critical issue in the Lehigh Valley, specifically the whole homes repairs program. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. There's certain areas of the state where it's been oversubscribed, and the Lehigh Valley is one of them. Others parts where the growth just isn't there. That's a program that we need to annually fund. We haven't done that. We use some of the COVID dollars. I think it's a really good opportunity to keep homeowners in their homes and invest in those. But in terms of relationships and working across government, the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission, the county level, the local level, one thing that we prioritize in my office has been building relationships at every level of government, working with Susan Wild, the Planning Commission, Becky Bradley in their office, really have different lenses at this issue. It can be very challenging to make change as an individual, but working in a coalition is something that's very important. So to your question on how do we improve that, it's really working together and building coalition around housing, because we know how important it is.
Anybody else want to weigh in? I know we're and it's not just one member. I think everybody's allowed to answer if they want. I don't know if anybody else has anything to say. All right. Well, there we go. Sorry that I sucked all the air out of the room. Well, moving on. So in that sense, I talked a little bit about the importance of each municipality's role. So Sarah, if you would, how can we better align our housing policies and programming with neighboring jurisdictions to address housing as a regional issue?
Well, housing is obviously a regional issue. What one community is doing or the demographic trends we're seeing is going to have an effect on the valley as a whole. But traditionally, and especially the way Pennsylvania law and municipalities are set up, everybody's been kind of going in their own direction and doing their own municipal planning over here without engaging their neighboring communities. But I think as housing has become a bigger issue, we have seen a huge shift in kind of the sort of collaboration. We have the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission is starting its housing attainability strategy. They have been trying to bring together some of like northern tier municipalities that may not have the planning staffs that the larger cities have to do those regional plans. And at the City of Bethlehem level, as we approached all of our housing strategy planning, we looked at it on a regional level, engaged our local municipalities, our neighbors. For example, in our choice neighborhood planning process, we have the borough of Freemansburg sitting on our steering committee and coming to those meetings, because we want to make sure that we're making decisions about both our policy and like our development plans in the context of the entire Lehigh Valley. And I really think it's just kind of the mindset of folks. We have the three, mayors who have formed the Free Cities Coalition, the DCD departments. We meet quarterly across those cities in both strategic, sometimes therapy sessions too. But I really just think we've seen kind of a change in the attitude of collaboration. And if we can keep working towards that, that's really what's going to be required.
Excellent. No, I would agree. I don't think any one community can tackle the crisis alone, and everybody does have to do their part. So it's refreshing to hear that. Lynn, what existing collaborations between jurisdictions have you seen work effectively in the past? And is there any specific example that you could potentially share?
A long time ago, we had a great collaboration in the Lehigh Valley, and that was on landlord outreach. I don't know if anybody is here that remembers that, but we had a all the housing authorities in the Lehigh Valley, the Northampton, Bethlehem, Allentown, we all met for a while and invited landlords to an event that allowed for, that encouraged them to take housing choice vouchers. That's a big problem these days, in that people wait on a waiting list for a housing choice voucher, which is used to be called Section 8. It's a little different, and they couldn't find a unit, and so they'd have to actually give the voucher back. So we met with landlords and found out what their issues were with the program, and then we invited lots of landlords to an event. So that was, and there's still a lot of landlord outreach going on, because there's such limited, very low income housing, as you described and everybody knows, and that's one group that can be satisfied if enough landlords participated. So if you know any landlords that may potentially consider the housing choice voucher program, that would help. We've also seen a lot of peer-to-peer with local governments, and also with housing counseling agencies that have collaborated with nonprofits. And fair housing councils that are multi-jurisdictional. Another collaboration that I really like is that when there's housing development at the beginning, if a private developer collaborates with a nonprofit, and it's in the contract, then a lot of times this is what some cities require, that a nonprofit or a CDC be involved. What is important is after the affordability period is over, that nonprofit almost has the first right of refusal to keep it affordable after that contract expires. So those are some examples.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Nobody else wants to weigh in? I know it's like a panel thing.
I think
I'm gonna have to like throw a curveball one of you guys or whatever.
just with the collaboration piece, I think a lot of it too, especially with the Realtor Association, talking with the property management agencies and the Realtor Association to collaborate on the housing voucher program, there is a stigma associated with it, unfortunately. It's getting over that hurdle, educating the landlords, certifying the landlords, making sure the properties meet the requirements of the housing choice voucher program. Because that's the biggest question I get when we have properties, especially, rentals are in such demand. And the minute I put one on the market, there's 100 text messages within the next couple of hours. And some of them are asking, besides the common questions of pets and are they allowed, but it's, do you take Section 8? Do you take housing choice? And you try to explain that to your sellers and do the research. And I'm fortunate enough, we work with a lot of low income, folks, as well as landlords who are willing to do the housing choice voucher, but it's so hard to get through the hurdle of explaining it and getting, having them understand that this is a benefit, and there's strategies even on the investment side of being a housing choice voucher landlord, where you're providing housing to folks while still meeting your investment goals. And I think sometimes you have to explain it in that language. As an investor, it's actually in your benefit to do the HCV programs. I think that's important.
Can I just add a couple sentences here? And I think two of the selling points that we always use with landlords, one is that they have screening. They're allowed to do the screening. You hear a lot of rumors about those are the worst tenants, and it turns out that they're not even a housing choice voucher tenant. It's the neighbor suspects that. But the screening is important, and a lot of people think they can't do that. And the other thing is the long-term reliability of always getting the subsidy, always having a tenant paying the correct portion of their rent, because there's a lot more turnover with other tenants. So those are two of the selling points, and please pass that on to your.
I do. I would say we focus more on the investment side. Why is it a great opportunity as an investor to keep an HCV client? Because of the stability, because there's a list of people waiting for that house. Should there be an issue with that particular tenant, right? Hopefully not. There's another list out there that somebody's ready to occupy. So for some investors, that's a great opportunity. So I did it again. Sorry.
Jonathan?
Just to add to
Hold it like this, like a microphone. Yeah, that's, I got it.
Just to add to that point and to say it, you know, in a different way, coming from the investment side of this discussion, it really does add what I call a credit enhancement for the investor, the landlord. Your tenant is really the federal government. And so I always say, you know, for our business, a large majority of our portfolio of housing is made up of Section 8 housing assistance payment contract communities, and we take choice voucher tenants. For us, and for us to fail, really the federal government would have to fail. So it's a credit enhancement from the investor standpoint. And then again, I believe this was said, but it creates real stability in your rent roll. You don't have to worry about continuous turnover. Tenants that receive subsidy want to protect their subsidy because they know how valuable it is to their families. So really, they're actually the best tenants that we have, are tenants receiving that subsidy.
And I just, for the record, I want to say we did not coordinate the blazer with the white shirt.
This
There was
is
no-
what we call this is like the Halloween costume thing. This is like you're going to a panel
You're-
discussion.
this is the
Yeah.
panel uniform.
No, we're all gonna take a picture after this. So, no, this is good. We're mixing it up. Now we got the energy flowing.
Just one.
No, we're
more
cutting you
kind of-
off. No, we're done.
One more thing, just in terms of collaboration, we have seen the Lehigh Valley Regional Homeless Advisory Board has been doing a lot of work around vouchers and landlord incentives, and trying to build up that database of landlords that then nonprofits and our service providers can turn to. So they've been testing out a lot of different incentives, and also the Housing Alliance has been doing a lot of state level work that, you know, they are taking into account. So I do think we are making some progress in terms of building up that capacity and incentives through those collaborations and among both service providers and housing authorities.
And I appreciate that. And I think it's great because it highlights, I think, just the value of not just local collaboration, but the power that we have as local jurisdictions, that we don't have to wait to take initiative. There are some easy things just by having conversations and breaking the stigma. We can do a lot to make sure we place people in quality housing. So I commend everybody for the work on the investment side, on the public sector side. Those are tough conversations. They can be, you know, uncomfortable conversations, but they're critical ones. So I think that's fantastic. This is to both Jonathan, Tiffany, and Sam. How can we encourage more public-private partnerships to develop affordable housing? And what role do you think each sector should play in those particular partnerships?
I would just say, I defer back to your presentation earlier today, and that's it. No.
Heard it here, folks, now.
I actually told him after he was done, I was like, I don't know why I'm here. I think you answered everything. But, you know, we saw that. I think the encouragement, you know, we're seeing that in the steel stacks. We're seeing that with some of the development that's happening. I think at the end of the day, you know, we want to continue down the path of working together, both privately and publicly. We're seeing a lot of development and growth. We're getting a lot of demand. I work with some developers, to your point earlier. I had some developers come down. We were looking at several acres of land, and regulation became the impediment. A lot of it was the tax incremental fund was also another challenge, you know, the things that come with development, the process. It took almost 3 years. So we started a project in Allentown, and I'm happy Allentown, actually, to their credit, the rezoning is fantastic. I would say that's a public method. That's something that's really going to help us. 3 years ago, I was with a development. We were putting 56 affordable townhomes in Allentown on Baker Drive. And unfortunately, it took 3 years to get through the process. Ultimately, they wind up selling it to someone else who's starting the project, and it's going up now. But it was so long, they just gave up. And these were out-of-state areas, so they didn't know the local rules, and it kind of were stuck in it. But, you know, more collaboration. There's private money out there, and I always tell people, you know, when it's a presidential stop, when your area is a presidential stop, that's a growth. That means that there's a sign of growth. It's no different when you see hospitals show up in certain areas. I tell my investors, that means something's coming, right? When St. Luke's or Lehigh Valley puts a large hospital in an area, they did the studies. They understand what's happening. So there's a private investment. Now the public investment is coming in and helping them and moving forward with that agenda. So that's important.
Yeah. Did you want to add to that, John?
Sure. I ended up working on my first single family home that I purchased around 21, and I remember being deathly afraid of the permitting office. And it wasn't that we wanted to skirt around doing things the right way, but it felt like there was this stigma around project obstruction. And so the more comfortable you can get developers, investors with the permitting office or DCED, that it's an open door. We're here to sit down, figure it out together. I think you're going to get, like he said, better collaboration. In addition, I think a lot of folks hear the word developer and they think that developers make tons and tons of money. When you look at it from a developer's perspective, there is money that's made, but there's a tremendous amount of risk that's taken. Sure. And if the public sector understands that risk, I think it will open up lines of collaboration. For instance, the number one thing that will ruin a developer is carry cost. And so speed through the permitting process and land use approvals, and knowing that you have a public sector or an administrative office that wants to work through those things expeditiously, correctly, but expeditiously, I think really builds a lot of comfort for a developer to develop in a certain municipality. And I would, not that we want to keep going back and referencing Allentown, but I would commend Allentown because their administrative office and DCED, they have open doors. You can email them, call them, they get back to you in the same day. They set the meeting in the same day. And you can go in there, sit down, figure out a project as a team. And I think that approach has a tremendous amount of value in it, especially when we talk about needing to build units quickly.
Tiffany, did you have anything to add?
Definitely. I mean, I think too, nonprofits and community groups are obviously essential partners in the Affordable Housing Initiative. Advocacy, service provisions, local knowledge, and capacity building efforts complement the resources and expertise of the private and public sectors. But it's about, loosening up those guidelines and allowing things to happen. And so we're not at a stalemate and we're not just sitting here and waiting and waiting and waiting.
Yeah, I think, there seems to be broad consensus, and I think most folks would agree that the carry costs are a critical component, and the longer that project is delayed, those costs eventually get passed on in some form or fashion. It's going to be to the tenants, and so I think it's in all of our interest to make sure that you don't want to cut any corners. You certainly want to do your due diligence for the public safety and the well-being of those who are going to reside in the given structure. But the more streamlined and the more efficient we can make that process, it is a win for everyone. And I also commend Mark and Vicky. I've always had a deeply collaborative relationship with them. We were just at the waterfront a few days ago for the beam signing for the new Weiler Brewery. And I have to say that I personally sat across the table from Vicky and Mark, and sometimes been a bit of a hard ass, but they've always, I've been the hard ass. I really wanted the project done, but they were very collaborative. They were deeply professional. And we worked it out, right? We figured out the zoning. We needed a nice mixed use overlay. We gave the developer the flexibility that they needed, but it was respectful, collaborative, and I think deeply responsible process. And so I commend you guys for that. And I've always had that experience with the city. So, and I think, we're all right. You want to build those relationships. So moving on, I want to ask Senator Miller, Jonathan, and Sam, how can we ensure that new housing developments serve the needs of the local community rather than just simply displacing them? Nick?
I'll kick us off. One thing I want to mention, yesterday in Philadelphia, the governor signed into, not into law yet, it's an executive order on a PA housing action plan. So this is on the state's radar. That's going to be a data-driven process and engaging with all the different regions in the Commonwealth. One thing I will mention, almost immediately after our county exec in Lehigh County texted me, Representative Schweier and Schlossberg, about how they've already allocated $300,000 to the Lehigh Valley Planning Commission to study housing. So it's on everybody's radar. It's just working collaboratively to actually address the issues. And as Representative Siegel talked about, it's not one easy, quick fix. In terms of the community, I think that's one thing that we're very concerned about. Putting different developments in different areas of the Lehigh Valley can be challenging because of like local ownership and stuff. But one thing I do want to talk about is the development at 8th and Walnut Street that Jonathan worked on. There was a low income tax credit involved in that. And we're familiar with the neighborhood improvement zone, that a lot of commercial redevelopment in downtown Allentown, but that was never supposed to be a housing driven policy, and to have an opportunity to actually address housing downtown, I think is something we're really excited about. Actually, my office is half a block away, so we can look out there and talk on the phone and talk about that project, and to bring affordable housing to downtown Allentown. I think we're really excited about that. I don't know if you want to touch on that project a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, and specifically with that project, and I think we've seen this a lot in downtown Allentown, and you see some of it in downtown Bethlehem and downtown Easton, but that project is being developed on an underutilized piece of land. It's a parking lot. So when you talk about displacing community members, nobody is being displaced in that project. But we're running out of those opportunities in the urban core. These parking lots are being developed. There's ways that we need to get creative around preventing displacement. I think that phased developments are a great way to help avoid displacement, as well as if you do a phased development, you could do a right to return policy where any residents that lived in that community where they may have been temporarily displaced, they have a right to return first. There are different tools and mechanisms that can be used to do that. But again, I think that, Representative Siegel said this in his presentation, but housing types and increasing density is going to create opportunities to allow those folks to return at affordable levels, and also invite new people into the community.
Sam, did you,
Yeah, I think.
the Blazer Bros?
Yeah, the Blazer Bros, all three of us. I think the biggest thing, what we realized, especially at COVID, I know from our association perspective, we're advocates for inclusionary zoning. We certainly want mixed-use development. We want that to be grow, that to grow. I think we realized post-COVID how important home ownership and housing is to the economy. Think about this. We grew the fastest, we recovered the quickest because of housing, because of the purchasing that went on after we came out of lockdowns and the amount of development and purchasing and what was going on. That helped us stabilize the area. That helped us grow. Displacement is always a concern. A lot of people feel that some of these high rises, there's a new one, Hamilton Park, I believe, the condos that are going in the old building that DLP Capital has. And there's concern that these higher priced condos will push people out of the neighborhood. I think if we incentivize it, if there's public incentivization for, keeping a segment of any development, kind of what you talked about in Bayfront, saying, give us a percentage that are going to be affordable, and you can do the development, and maybe just incentivize a little bit more for these developers to provide that component that we may be missing in some of these communities. Because I think a lot of people want to see a metropolitan area. And Allentown being, I know we keep mentioning it is the larger of the city. It has a lot of movement. And the truth is one day it will be a metropolis. It will be a big city, but we don't want to obviously push people out of the area. So I think incentivization, making sure that we're collaborating with the private partners to say, yes, you can do this project. It looks wonderful, but just can we have a component here that's going to help people? So.
If I could just talk about that project specifically, that's the first time in downtown in recent history that we've had condos coming on the market, and to have that home like ownership piece. I think it's exciting to see that the market is going to attempt to see if the market, people want to buy those. I'm curious to see how those move, and I think they're a little pricey.
They're doing very well.
Yeah, I think they're a little pricey, but that's an office building that conversion. I don't think.
We can split it, Nick. We can split it.
Well, yeah, right. I don't think a lot of folks would really have expected that to be converted to residential because the floor plate is so large. There's a lot of dead space in the middle. Whereas the PP&L Tower we know is being converted. It's a smaller floor plate. There's not a lot of dead space or loft space in the middle. Both projects across the street from each other. It's going to be interesting to watch those play out.
Lynn, you wanted to add?
Yes, I live in Philadelphia now. The city has a requirement that the neighborhood association where the development's going to go, that the project gets referred to a committee, and that committee has recommending power of whether that development should be there, and some other advice that they can give. We still have too many new luxury buildings that have been built, apartment buildings in Center City, but I think that it's a great idea for every community every city and town to have a input from the neighborhood association where that development's going to be.
Yeah. Oh, Sarah, did you have?
Yeah, and I think there are opportunities from like a local government side in the way that you approach both like market rate development is good. We have a shortage of supply, but we also don't want to be displacing our existing residents. And kind of a part of our housing study, we did a market value analysis and calculated the displacement risk ratio for the city. And there is not a neighborhood in the city of Bethlehem where there is not an elevated displacement risk. So that is something that we have in the context of all of our community development and economic development decisions that we're making. And like, I think a project that we're hoping to mitigate that risk and the approach we're taking is in partnership with Community Action Lehigh Valley and Community Action Development Bethlehem. We have the Gateway on 4th at 4th and William Street, which is a mixed income, hopefully will be awarded LIHTC tax credit project in South Bethlehem. But as we are working on that project, we are also looking at the surrounding neighborhood and how can we increase home ownership and do targeted housing rehab and street improvements and facade repairs in the neighborhood to make sure that the residents that are already in the neighborhood, which is one of our more affordable neighborhoods, are not in any way pushed out, and that they are also lifted up as part of that process. So I think you can do both things, but you have to be very intentional and thoughtful about how you do it. And it again requires those collaborations.
Yeah, and I think everybody here highlighted the necessity of not just collaboration, but also understanding the financial realities associated with making those goals and objectives a reality. It's hard to put an affirmative demand on a developer when adding that affordable housing would make the project, financially unviable, right? There has to be some form of subsidy or assistance. A number of cities have experimented with housing bonds where they basically buy out the cost associated with some of the units. Jonathan, I commend you. Your focus is on mixed income. You're trying to create those mixed income environments. That's something we want to move away from, right? Is the idea of concentrated poverty. Our poor folks live in one building and people of means and who are well off live in a different structure, right? That's what we're trying to move away from. We want to create those mixed income communities. We want doctors and anesthesiologists to live next to janitors and school nurses in the same building, right? And I think that that's what we're trying to build, especially owner occupied. Actually, I toured the condos a couple days ago. They've had hundreds of inquiries. I actually think they're going to struggle they're going to have more demand than there is actual units to fill. But I think, it speaks to an opportunity that perhaps maybe we missed out on. Maybe there was an opportunity to subsidize the project or offer an abatement in exchange for 10% or something, or some of those units being offered at an affordable rate so that maybe folks had that chance in Allentown to get an owner occupied opportunity. But I still think it is a good thing, for the city to first time, build something it hasn't built in decades. But I appreciate all those perspectives. I'm going to move on now to Sarah and Lynn. I want to talk a little bit about how can land banks be used to facilitate housing development, and what role do you think they play in community revitalization?
I'd like to see some new and better models of land banks, but I think most of those come from nonprofits and community development corporations being the lead in the land bank. In Philadelphia, there was a lot of lobbying, advocating to create a land bank, and it ended up being administered by the redevelopment authority and not in the way that the communities had envisioned. On the other hand, when I hadn't really thought about the funding that you mentioned in your presentation, so they have an ongoing funding source with the redevelopment authority. It's just that it's almost like it goes to the land goes almost to the highest bidder. So, and I think they're in the process of trying to revise how they're implementing it. I think when they're done right, they really can keep affordability over time. And there's another strange possible model of, we've been looking a lot more at manufactured housing. That's what people used to call trailers. But now they've greatly improved the look and the design of them. And but people have to pay, the owner has to pay land rent. So I think that's another possible model of having a land bank related to the manufactured housing. So that's, have to look at creative ways to do it. I think when they first came out, and that was years ago, and I saw a very successful nonprofit model. But I think it's a great idea because it does keep that affordability in that location and in those locations.
I think if you're a community that's dealing with a significant amount of blight, land banks can be really powerful tools. That is really not the case of what we've been dealing with in Bethlehem. Our blighted property list is fewer than 10 properties right now, and the market's really been taking care of them. But we've seen in Easton has been doing some really kind of innovative things through its RDA in terms of taking blighted properties, exploring land banking, and also building like a rental portfolio. So I'm very curious to, watch what they do over there. You've seen them be very powerful tools in like cities like Detroit. And there is a lot of potential when you're trying to, reverse neighborhood blight, stabilize a neighborhood, and ensure long-term affordability. But it's not really something that's kind of in our toolbox in Bethlehem.
Yeah, so I think with any municipality, obviously, right, it's nuanced and it's obviously specific to the market realities and the housing environment that they find themselves in. Some cities are more fortunate than others in terms of their absence of blight. I also think community land trusts play a huge role in creating affordability as well by maintaining that stability in terms of price increases. But I appreciate, yeah, that perspective, and I think they are certainly a tool in the toolbox for some municipalities. Moving on to Lynn and Tiffany, if you could just provide a little perspective on like what the implications of enforcing deed restrictions on housing affordability and how can funding be secured for that purpose?
I think I remember. I'll tell you, there's certain funds that require types of deed restrictions, and those of you who work with these programs know with the CDBG and the home program, because they're looking for people who are under a certain income limit. There's requirements for how many years you have to stay in the property and things like that, and that's a deed restriction. But you have to be careful with a lot of this because when I lived in Harrisburg, I remembered that there were people who quit their jobs to be income eligible, and then they sold their house, waited long enough and sold their house after that time period was gone, and that neighborhood became gentrified. So it's tricky, but I do think it's a good solution because, and I don't know exactly how they can be funded. I guess that's about all I have to say about it.
Okay.
Well, I can say that obviously deed restrictions would ensure that there are units available for lower income individuals. But it also does limit financial returns for developers and potential resale values on the homes. And managing deed restrictions is extremely complicated and complex. But as far as on a funding perspective, mixing private and public partnerships is essentials, federal state grants, tax incentives, zoning benefits, subsidies. Private partnerships can, introduce capital and efficiency that's needed as well.
Anybody, anyone else is? Okay, we'll move on then to, we're coming.
Thank you. We have our rental licensing process within the city. So we're going to link those deed restrictions to the rental license to ensure compliance. As far as home ownership, I would also say you could look, a lot of municipalities have a pre-sale inspection process. That would be another kind of choke point that you could link so that you're monitoring that. But I do think, when significant amounts of public resources get invested in these projects, we need to ensure the long-term affordability so that, the folks that were able to benefit from those resources pay it forward to the next generation when they move on from that home.
Thank you, Mark.
And I would kind of add to Mark that we've been looking at any sort of incentives that we tie, trying to guarantee that long-term affordability and pushing for the longest periods possible through the Alley House pilot. We're looking at a 20-year deed restriction on that property that we know for 20 years that alley house will be rented to an income qualified tenant. And as we've started to expand more in trying to do rental rehab through Lead and Healthy Homes and are building a rental rehab program, all of that funding will have those affordability provisions tied to them. And, we've had through our, federal entitlement programs had a lot of just success working with community action on housing rehab and then, putting those affordability restrictions through the land trust. And it's led to a lot of opportunities.
It's good, and I share the sentiment that I think anytime you're providing some sort of public support, it's important that we have some sort of provision or string attached to make sure that we're protecting the interest of course, the public good. So, Lynn, also directed towards you, so you're in the hot seat here. I think equally important is not just finding people housing, but making sure that they have the support services that they need. So how can support services be integrated into housing developments to promote long-term stability for those residents?
Well, some of the HUD programs require or include supportive services. For example, our 811 program for people who are disabled and any over 55 housing that's developed requires supportive services. Those over 55 communities. I was at PHFA when they started the supportive services department. Tells you how old I am. And they recognized that in multifamily it was important. It took a while to kind of explain to the management companies that that this was not just a soft thing, but an important thing, and how it can protect the investment of the property. And HUD started the Service Coordinator Program, which are individual grants that can go to our multifamily properties. But I have to say I was very, well, one other thing, the Medicaid. Medicaid is being used more and more for supportive services. And there's a few communities that are way ahead on this, but I think there's a lot of opportunities for that. Now in Philadelphia, they started their own HMO, so they can use those services for people with mental health issues or other disabilities. But I happened to be lucky enough to be at the announcement yesterday that the governor had. It was a small group at a press conference, and the model that they're having is roundtables where they're going to go around the state and they're going to have DCED and Department of Human Services as the leads. So I'm really optimistic that the Department of Human Services, which has potential to provide a lot of these supportive services, will be more in the, I mean, they've already increasingly been in the game, but now they're going to be even more so in the game on the supportive services that they have. DCED has some programs like the Neighborhood Assistance Program and others that maybe CSBG that can help fund some services also. And making partnerships with the organizations in the community, with the Department of with the Community Action Agency, for example, but also the senior citizen organizations, the Area Agency on Aging, and others that already have existing programs. There can be relationships and contracts with them.
Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, I think we can agree in many circumstances that housing is just one component of that stability, and they might be recovering from PTSD or substance abuse, and having those on-hand services to make sure that they have all the care that they need to maintain that stability, I think is a vital component. I would add maybe even child care to that as well, integrating, those critical cost barriers that might prevent families from entering the workforce. So this is an interesting one too. We know obviously at the end of the day, it all comes down to dollars and cents. So both Lynn and Nick, if you could just tell me, what are some underutilized funding sources that could potentially be tapped to support housing projects here in the Valley? Nick?
So thinking of the tax credit programs we have on the state, you mentioned the NAP, the Neighborhood Assistance Program. My office was crucial in delivering doubling the program. It went from $36 million to $72 million That's statewide. That's a good opportunity for driving the relationship between business and industry with our communities. We look at that as incentivizing investment from the private sector, and the fact that you can use that on addressing housing is something that's an exciting opportunity. Otherwise, in terms of the low-income tax credits, the 6% tax credits are underutilized. We've got a huge amount of dollars in the hundreds of millions allocated to that. I think even after talking to Jonathan, understanding the reality of investing those dollars can be challenging. The 9%, it's awarded yearly, whereas the 6%, it's on a rolling basis. But the 9% are more financially feasible to actually get a project done. So trying to tweak those programs and make it more realistic that those are going to deliver. I think that was good feedback to understand that, being on a rolling basis and, having the dollars allocated is some feedback that we're going to take back to our leadership and try to deliver on.
Thank you. Jonathan? Yeah.
If I could comment on that, so everybody knows it's, you have the 9% tax credit, like Nick said, and I think it's the 4. And the 4 is we're leaving so much money on the table every year, and it's going back to the state unutilized. And part of the issue with it is the program needs some reform. There was some reform that was proposed earlier this year to basically lower the threshold of debt that the project had to support to be able to qualify for 4% tax credits. There's a few years ago, they basically put a floor on the tax credit rate, which helped as well. But, to Senator Miller's point, like, we're sending tremendous amounts of dollars back, or dollars are going unutilized, where those dollars could go into the 9% bucket, or we could do things to reform that program. And, I think that just starting with those resources that we already have will make quite a difference here in Pennsylvania. The open application or open enrollment component of the 4% program is huge. One of the challenges with the 9% program is that it is an annual application cycle, and oftentimes it's not even annual, it's every 18 months. So that can be really challenging because you're looking at putting out a new project every 18 to 36 months from inception to, ribbon cutting. So those are some of the challenges. I think that's a huge point that can be made and taken back to the state level to try to see some reform.
Thank you. Lynn, did you want to?
I also used to work for DCED, DCED, and I was really thrilled yesterday to hear about the NAP, the Neighborhood Assistance Program, being expanded. And so I thank all the legislators who helped with that and make that happen. I wonder whether the historic tax credit is something that could be more fully utilized. And I noticed there was some emphasis here on reusing buildings. Pennsylvania has a lot of beautiful historic buildings, and I think that's something to look into. One thing that I hate is when people have to end up returning money. So there's a report on HUD's website that talks about home money is about to expire and has not been used. So I think that's always a little bit sad. But one of the funds that HUD always ends up having to get back and never having enough applications is our lead-based paint remediation and healthy homes funds. Some of those programs are very well used, but the actual lead remediation, which can keep people in their homes and healthy, and it's good to hear that Bethlehem has a grant, but that's something that could be better utilized. And we also have a program that's called Foster Youth to Independence, and that's a partnership with the housing authorities and at a social service agency, which lets youth aging out of foster care get vouchers. And we don't really have that fully utilized. So those are some examples.
Well, thank you. Nick, yeah?
If I could add, we did expand the historical tax credit from $5 to $20 million this year. In this year's budget, piece of feedback that we got almost immediately was that the cap per project isn't high enough. So although the program's larger, to actually support some of these projects, we need to allow them to tap into more of those dollars. So it's something that we're going to work on.
Well, thank you. And I think, yeah, it's always a crime when we leave money on the table, especially in the amounts that I think are available, especially with LIHTC credits. Those are critical for projects penciling out. And again, yes, Mark.
So I think we also need to be thinking about this outside of like what I'd call traditional funding sources. Of the historic tax credit's a great example, but not to always look to HUD. And with the Infrastructure Reduction Act, there is a lot of money that's going to be coming out through like the Department of Energy that you can do weatherization and sustainability type improvements. And that's good sources of money for housing rehab. If we can help make these buildings a little more weather tight, put on a new roof, that's the type of investment these places need. I know the governor's has a special action team that's just totally dedicated in thinking about ways of tapping into this infrastructure reinvestment money and how do we get that deployed across the Commonwealth. So those are some good sources.
Yeah, Mark, no, I appreciate that. And I think it's important to think creatively. Obviously, not every dollar necessarily means housing, but there's a way to repurpose it and perhaps make it contingent or connected to housing. And certainly environmental related grants, I think, are important.
Yeah, and like to Mark's point that this has been other areas of collaboration, and we're trying to work with CALV and the city of Allentown and Bethlehem and working together on some collaborative grant applications of thinking about how can we stack all of those funding sources to be able to get the most amount of money into each house. And like weatherization is a way to actually make a house more affordable to live in long term, so that you're not dealing with rising, electricity bills or heating bills that are pricing you out or force you to make a choice between, keeping on your lights or paying your mortgage or your rent for the month. And just we had the opportunity to meet with some of the governor's team this week and talk about how they're approaching their IRA rollout. And they're doing it really in a way of trying, actually, asking us how do you think this works, and doing that collaboration now in the program design that I'm hoping will make for a much smoother rollout and make it more effective and more money getting into, actual projects and not leaving it on the table.
No, I think that's valuable. Maximizing and stacking dollars. And then, of course, I think importantly is the Commonwealth trying to, I agree with Mark, create financing opportunities outside the traditional federal window. And I think, I spoke to that. I think, the more state dollars we can put towards affordable housing, the more we can allow our developers to maybe not necessarily need LIHTC, and we can provide some of the bridge financing and and fill the gap. I think makes it that much more expeditious, not having to wait on the federal government to make determinations.
One other example, because we were talking about weatherization, and there's a group of architects in Philadelphia that are leads on something called passive homes, and they design and help people with rehab of properties that make them so weather tight and so they use so many different ideas in those homes that it sometimes turns out to be a positive value in that people are not paying utilities at all, and sometimes they're even getting money back. So that you can look it up, the passive homes. It's Blue Path Design is one of the people that are doing it.
Fantastic. Did you have a question?
Touched on it, but I wanted to know, thank you. Getting him the mic, that's a bad thing. I wanted to know if anyone on the panel have thought about tiny homes. I know that Lancaster is a big city that's enjoying the tiny home boom, and I've looked at some. But we have not addressed that. And I know we have tight zoning. I know the city of Allentown is here and the city of Bethlehem. So some of our seniors that I've talked to have said that they need a home that is on one floor because they live multiple floors. And we're not even addressing that. The state of Pennsylvania has 55% of seniors will be at that age within the 10-year plan that the Department of Aging is rolling out. And we don't have enough homes for seniors. But we haven't even touched on is it possible to have a tiny home village for seniors that is affordable? And also to include solar lighting. We haven't touched on that as well.
Maybe I'll have the panel integrate that into some like future responses. I just want to make sure we keep moving things along. So I do want to ask Sarah, what grants or subsidies are available for making safety-focused changes to existing buildings?
Well, we already, touched on the Lead and Healthy Homes program is a huge opportunity. And, the city of Bethlehem was a recipient of both programs for the first time through our health bureau in the last few years. And, we're hoping to be able to continue that grant. Obviously, most of, we have housing rehab programs and integrating those together. We fund ours through our CDBG and home allocations. We also have seen a lot of collaboration with local banks who have been looking at like low interest loan programs. We've been talking about especially for that like 80 to 125% of AMI that federal programs are leaving out, but those folks are still cost burdened and struggling to stay in their homes. I think one of the biggest challenges is there are a lot of resources out there, but how do you communicate that and make it a smooth process? And having to apply to each program and income qualify, like if we could have a universal application for all of these programs. And I know it's something that a lot of us have been talking about, like how can we do that when we're working together collaboratively? We've had like just with us inside the city of Bethlehem, we have our team in DCED and the Health Bureau working to talk on cases. We're talking with CADB and CALV on every house that we're working on to try to streamline those processes. But I think there's actually a lot of money out there. It's just more connecting the property owners and homeowners with the money. And in terms of just kind of on the tiny home question, that's something that we really need help on the state level because in the international building code that we're operating under in the city of Bethlehem, the state would need to adopt, I believe it's Appendix Q, if I have that correct, to allow for tiny home construction. Philadelphia, is kind of its entity out on its own, just by nature of being a first-class city. But any communities that you see that have been doing them, they have found loopholes around the building code to do it. Like in some cases, they are not actually making them permanent structures, and you can only live in them for 180 days a year. I know that's the case of one out kind of in the Harrisburg area.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just have to jump in about the tiny homes because I've done a fair amount of work on that. And I prefer the model where there's self-contained. I think there's other models where there's joint community space, joint kitchens, joint bathrooms. And I think those individual, and I think that might help to get it through the zoning process if they're individually contained and they're long-term housing.
Yeah, more along the lines of like a small efficiency dwelling unit. Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. And one of the weird reforms I'm interested in is called single point access corridors. So many people probably see apartments, they're built, it's a double loaded corridor, right? One long hallway, two staircases, 2 points of egress. Seattle for over 60 years has had point access corridors. So it's one large central staircase and one elevator down the middle. You actually are able to get larger units and larger floor plans. One of the big barriers in the housing market is that we don't build a lot of 3 and 4 bedroom apartments. So families of a larger size don't even want to live. In Europe, it's quite a common architectural standard. And the first thing that comes to everyone's mind is we'll all die in a fire. You won't. Europe has actually far fewer fire safety related fatalities than we do with our building code standards. So single staircase is an interesting way, and it's actually an area where cities can kind of play. Seattle, like I said, has had it on the books for over 50 years. And it's a way to add additional housing stock and infill development and actually create larger floor plans for families. So I think there's some really unique ways that cities can insert themselves in the architectural and the building codes debate that don't jeopardize safety, but create those smaller units that people want. So moving on to our next question, and I think gets to the heart of what we're trying to do here is both to Senator Miller and Sarah, if you could, what are the benefits and challenges of creating mixed income communities? Senator Miller, Sarah, would you like?
I'll start. Obviously, there's like some stigma around mixing income classes, but there's studied benefits to mixed income residences, including reduced crime. You talk about poverty pockets. That also addresses some of that by having mixed income developments. But there is definitely the stigma of putting low income and moderate income and high income all in the same building. It can be challenging to actually make that happen.
I'm a big supporter of the idea of mixed income communities. I live in one. I love my neighborhood. As Senator Miller was saying, countless studies have demonstrated the benefits to children, to families on health, life expectancy, economic development, educational outcomes. It's again, kind of, when you think about those benefits, it's the idea of like, we're going to spend the money somewhere. Where do you want to spend it? And where do you want to invest it? Do you want to invest it in keeping children stably homed? And then they're going to have much better educational outcomes, or do you want to be doing interventions, later in the criminal justice system? But one of the big challenges of creating mixed income communities is our zoning and land use policies that we have created that are often very exclusionary, very much prioritize single family housing. And, we've kind of, seen some of that debate happening in Bethlehem over some, hypothetical proposals right now.
Not at the church. No.
One of the things that I really like that HUD has done, and as we're going through our choice neighborhood planning process, is the extreme emphasis on creating mixed income communities and deconcentrating poverty. We created the Marvine Pembroke, BHA properties and really kind of isolated them on a side of the city that we haven't done any planning. We haven't made many investments. And it was kind of like, as long as that's over there and, nobody's showing up at city council and complaining, we'd historically ignored the neighborhood. We're trying to change that now, but there's a lot of work to do. And part of that, process is like, if you're going through the choice neighborhood process, and you can go outside of your boundary, but you cannot put it in an area that meets certain, they only want it in what HUD calls like high opportunity areas, neighborhoods that have those things in place that are going to allow families, to thrive. And that was something that we were really, through our market value analysis, be able to both, using HUD tools and then some of those more local indicators of identify those high value opportunity areas of communities where we have opportunities for infill and like creating mixed income communities.
No, I applaud both of you for, your advocacy and your work in that space. And I think that the evidence around mixed income communities is fairly incontrovertible. I think there's broad consensus. It's better for public safety, public education, long-term life outcomes, socioeconomic well-being, and we can choose to pay for it now or later as a society, to your point, by creating negative, social externalities. And, I think, again, it really comes down to educating the public, right? There are misconceptions. We saw that at First Press. We saw that at the church, and then that issue. A lot of misconceptions, right? A lot of, I think, emotional, visceral reactions, maybe disconnected from the reality of the situation. But glad to hear it. And I think, mixed income doesn't have to mean large multifamily. It is those missing middle types of opportunities that create a really income diverse neighborhood. Here we go. So, what role, Sarah, can community organizations and nonprofits play in supporting the rehab of affordable housing units?
Well, I mean, I think Community Action's an amazing example of that, and Chuck and his housing division, it's really about that collaboration and working very closely together. And I would love to see that capacity grow, because if you're going into Philadelphia, there are so many organizations doing it. And right now we have 2 nonprofits doing it. So anything we can do to help them grow and build their capacity. And I think that's something as local governments we've been thinking about a lot as we've been looking at all of the funding opportunities that have come out of like the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the COVID relief and CARES, is how can we bring more funding into the region and use it to build sustainable capacity that helps us meet those long-term goals.
Fantastic. And of course, the collaborative aspect. I think, it's all of the above effort, right? Public, private, and nonprofit. Jonathan, this is for you. In the Lehigh Valley, we're very blessed to have some tremendous, union apprenticeship programs and some great local contractors. And I think it's important we, involve them and engage them, and we use local workforce when we're repurposing housing. So in your assessment, what strategies can be implemented to develop and support local contractors when we are rehabilitating local affordable housing units?
I think one of the best things that could be done to support local contractors. When you think of local, you think of union labor that is, unionized local to the area. You think of open shop labor, which is maybe your small contractor that's starting out. I think from a developer standpoint, what we could do and what we could work on with local municipalities and the local union is creating smaller bid packages for local contractors, so that maybe you could attract some of the smaller contractors to a project. Striking a balance on a project between union and non-union labor, I think, is really important, because you want to hold a really high standard of construction. And at the same time too, like projects, you want to be able to create opportunity for a growing workforce and be able to incentivize new businesses to get into the trade. So I think merging the two is the key, and breaking down projects in a way where they can be bid by both groups, I think is incredibly important.
And I will add, our school districts have forged really great relationships with our local apprenticeship program. So I think there's a perfect pipeline here where we use local rehabilitation projects to get folks onboarded into apprenticeship programs and literally rebuild their own communities and learn a skill set at the same time. So I think this is where the public-private partnership kind of component comes into play. And I think, Lynn, yeah, by all means, please.
I just want to mention Section 3, and those of you who work with this know about it, but it's something HUD's spending a lot more time on, making sure that it actually is implemented. And what that means is that when there's any federal money at all in a development, that you have to use basically local contractors, people who are living in that neighborhood. They have to be paid wage rates, but there's a lot more effort being made to request that people advertise in the neighborhood for the to use people in some of those developments, et cetera. So Section 3 is something I just want to put out there on the table.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the value of incentives and, again, a collaborative spirit between the developer and the public sector to make sure that the community benefits in the end. And yes, sir.
Like I'm not loud enough. Okay. One of the things we've recently applied for some funding is we work with a lot of small contractors, and what Jonathan was saying is really true. You do have to break your bids down into separate things for union and non-union. One of the things we found is we're developing small contractors lately. We've developed 5 new contractors in the last 2 years. And what I mean by developing, taking a small contractor with maybe 1 or 2 guys, making sure he's properly licensed, insured, make sure he knows how to go get his HIC license, make sure he's properly insured, make sure he's trained for lead, all the other things that we require. And we've seen these guys develop from 1 or 2 guys to people who have 3 or 4 crews of contractors. And it's a lot of times we always talk about, when we talk about workforce development, training people to be carpenters, but they're not going to be a contractor for many years. You know what I mean? And what developers need and people like us need are contractors. So I'd like to see more funding in that direction where we help develop contractors.
Okay. So moving on, projects are finished. We've successfully completed that. To Tiffany and Sam, how can we measure the success and the impacts of these rehab programs on local housing markets, and also importantly, the residents' quality of life?
So obviously, one of the biggest things, I always go back, my former profession before real estate was a law enforcement officer, and I was in the city of Bethlehem for many years. And what I would say to you is, for me, it goes back to the broken windows policy. When you have a neighborhood and a particular property is dilapidated, it has broken windows, tends to bring down the value, it stigmatizes the neighborhood. It causes, the community to feel the impact, right, indirectly, because that particular property is not maintained. And so by rehabbing these properties and doing things to improve value, of course, value follows investment. So as these properties are being rehabbed and as these things are going, we're going to see the values increase on these properties, and certainly is going to help them. How do we track them? Of course, that's what we do as an association. Market trends as far as the retention rates of homes, how many of the homeowners stay with their homes. We're looking at, obviously, the shifts in the market absorption rate is another metric. What's the turnover rate of that community? Stable communities don't turn over very often, right? So you can see that we measure that. I would say that a partnership between the local realtor association with the Greater Lehigh Valley, putting these mechanisms, which, by the way, we already track because of our industry, collaborating with us and saying, we need your data so we can assess whether or not these programs are successful or not. And I think we do a pretty good job, although it's from a sales and a marketing perspective, much of the data we use could be barometers, could be measurements that could be used on the local level to help with assessing, are we doing a good job at what we're doing in these communities? What's the turnover rate? What's the value increases? What's the appreciation every year? A lot of people don't realize it's FHFA puts out stats about appreciation rates in the Lehigh Valley from 2004 till now. Appreciation in the valley has been over 120%. That's even with the crash in the middle, right? So, value add, right, by doing the things in the community. So there's ways to measure it, both at the federal and local level. I would say your greatest resource is going to be our association. Asher, our Director of Government Affairs, is here. I think reaching out to us and saying, we need data. We have the data that can help support any endeavor you're looking to do on a housing perspective, because we keep track of that. And the way we look at housing is similar to the way that affordability is looked at, right? We look at trends, we look at some of the market information. So I think working together with trade associations like ours is one of the best ways to track whether or not you're successful and grant money and dollars are being spent correctly. And that's how we can see that through our statistics and data.
That's excellent. I think critical to making the public case about the value of, mixed income communities and mixed income neighborhoods is making sure we demonstrate that there's an ROI. Your property values not only go up, but you improve the quality of life and the safety in the neighborhood. Breaking that stigma, I think, requires statistics. So I applaud you both for providing that and being a resource.
Right, yeah, what resident well-being and, just community level outcomes, crime rates and, education, school performance, things like that. So yeah, just being able to track them, surveys, simple things like that, and just making sure everybody has access to those programs.
We're going to move on. This has obviously always been a critical issue, especially for the Lehigh Valley's 3 cities, and especially as a former council person, we often dealt with the issue of slumlords and out-of-state landlords that didn't necessarily value or care about their properties. So to you, Sarah, how can we incentivize landlords to register their properties and, most importantly, maintain them to the city's required standards?
I mean, you don't have to incentivize them to register them. You can just make them register them. And that is what we do in the city of Bethlehem. We did in 2020 turn to a much more proactive registration and inspection process, because previously we put the onus on the landlords to call us at tenant turnover and say, my tenant's turning over, come inspect my unit. And that meant we were getting into the same small fraction of units that were well kept generally, and landlords who were interested in complying. And we were not seeing thousands and thousands of units. So in 2020, we rolled out a much more proactive inspection program. Every property must be registered and licensed annually. Standard rentals are inspected once every 3 years on a 3-year cycle, and student housing has to be inspected every year, just because of the hard abuse that they take.
That makes sense.
And I have my rental licensing manager is a pit bull. If you are operating under the radar, she will find you. We had pushback at first. They, we're calling it a money grab and all the various things. And it is an ongoing challenge. We're getting into the properties, but getting them then to actually close the loop and resolve the violations is an ongoing challenge. But we're getting into 5,000 to 8,000 units every year. And we just got through our first 3-year cycle. We have had to do a lot of hand holding. And honestly, some of my inspectors are really acting as project managers, because a lot of these landlords have bought up a lot of properties with no idea how to actually manage them. And they don't even know what all of their holdings are. That has been the most shocking thing to me, that they don't even know what they own. And that has been the fast change we have seen in Bethlehem, in that commodification of our rental market. We went from a lot of small mom and pops to a lot of much more big holdings, especially in the student rental market. So I don't think the licensing part is the struggle. It's closing the loop on the inspection. And that is why we're developing a rental rehab program right now that will have affordability provisions tied to it and would not be available to large landlords. We're still kind of working on the guidelines of what those caps would be, of how many holdings you could have, but hoping to get at those folks that really do want to provide a higher quality of housing but can't afford to. And then I think one of the challenges right now is just that there's not, we can file a citation and take them to court, but it's on when the magistrate wants to schedule the hearing. That could be 3 or 4 months. And then it's not something that constables are really going after on warrant.
Yeah, I think
could use some more teeth on that enforcement end.
Yeah, the speed and efficiency. I know that when I was on council, the biggest problem was just the inspection cycle was way too long. You know, we're supposed to inspect them every 5 years, but I can tell you that that was never happening. So properties were going sometimes a decade or more before someone was getting in there to take a look at it. And by that point, the property was almost certainly like beyond salvaging, or there were so many code violations that, you know, the tenant was living in subpar squalor-like conditions. And I will add, it's been an issue as of recent. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the ever-growing share of private equity that's purchasing single-family homes, and I think that's becoming a tremendous issue for our housing market. In the first 3 months of 2024, nearly 1 in 5 homes in the United States that was purchased by a private equity firm, and so I think that's a real issue that we have to tackle. Senator Miller, did you have?
Yeah, just to add on that, we've been working on a bill to address just that. I mean, the
Darn you.
1,000 unit plus.
I was about to do it. No, I'm just
yeah.
kidding. Good. I'm
Um,
glad. I love you, Nick.
Yes, I mean, it's a very challenging topic to, you know, because you want to balance private property rights, but also, you know, folks need homes to live in.
Yeah.
But, you know, if a private equity firm out of New York wants to own 1,000 units and then, you know, neglect a ton of them, and we've seen that. So we're looking into that, and we've got some bill language, but just trying to be very mindful of all the different stakeholders, from the developers and but most importantly, our people that need a place to live. I will add one more thing on the enforcement. We have a bill on, actually with Rep. Mursky out of Erie. In our last year, in our first year, did a tour around the state looking for ways that improve investment on blighted properties. And Erie, very similar to Allentown and Bethlehem and Easton, they've got a really good program up there. And the representative from up there, we're working on a grant program for municipal code enforcement. I think that'd be very helpful.
It's good, especially for smaller communities.
Correct.
So, Sam?
If I get, one of the other things I would say, because, you know, I appreciate the enforcement arm. Everybody goes to enforcement, and you can certainly beat everybody into compliance. I think some of the other challenges is education. I think maybe there should be a mandatory educational program for landlords, especially new landlords. You know, Chuck said this with helping develop contractors. I get a lot of amateur real estate investors, and there's people with money that come to the area, wants to buy properties and own properties. Some of them own multiple single-family units, or they own multi-units, right? Don't have the business sense, don't know the regulatory environment in which they're operating. They just have cash, they're buying, they listen to a podcast, they heard we're a great area to buy. They're in here investing money. We don't want to discourage through over-regulation and over-enforcement in the area. So I think another component that could be added is, what if we met with some of the nonprofits? What if we had like a similar first-time home buyer course? We had a first-time investor course that the city's mandated, and it said, not only this is the environment you're going to operate in, but also here's some resources when you personally run into trouble with your tenant, or you run into trouble with you know, something related to the rehabbing of the property. What do you do when you have to move a tenant out because the damage, or there's a leak and it's so bad that you have to remove the tenant and put them in? What does the landlord do? Who do they contact at the city to help with rapid rehousing, right? So I think, you know, yes, we can beat them into compliance. I also don't want to discourage investment, right? Because what happens is when cities overinvest, they go outside of the cities and put their dollars in. And although we want to encourage single-family home ownership and people to own their own properties, investors do fund and do pay taxes, right? There's a business privilege tax and things that we want to do. So education, I think, just really taking that first-time investor who's buying their first property and say, we're going to have a mandatory class for you because this is new, and we're going to teach you how to be a great investor for our city. And I think that's a great idea. It's just something to take back across the board, because I know we encourage education, but it's hard. We don't have the regulatory enforcement. You do, right?
Jonathan?
I just want to jump in here quick. I think, you know, in concept, that's a great idea, and I agree with you, that program should exist. But speaking from experience and knowing folks, specifically out-of-state investors and many local ones, they just don't care. And that's the bottom line. And I lean more towards taking, you know, Sarah's approach with enforcement. And frankly, I think the best, going back to the original question, like, how do we incentivize investors? One of the best incentives is just uniform enforcement, right? We own properties in downtown Allentown where we've done a really great job maintaining them. And then the one next door hasn't been inspected for a tremendous amount of time. I live in a property where we spent significant capital to renovate it. The one next door has sat blighted for, you know, 10 years and hasn't been inspected. I think uniform enforcement and persistent enforcement is the key. And just making sure that just because this landlord is responsive, you don't keep going back to him. Go to the ones that aren't responsive and make sure that this enforcement is equal across the board. So I do actually think like a strong approach is probably the right approach. Because for me, the incentive of complying and knowing that others are complying is that the neighborhood will ultimately start to look better, which Bethlehem has experienced. And with that comes value. And for me, value is, liquidity, and, that's good for business. So.
So, yeah, hi, my name's Rob Sear. I'm an investor also. So, yeah, I think, and this relates to Section 8 too. I've talked to people, they don't like, I've had Section 8 on right now, but the reason they don't like it, one is they don't understand that they can screen people. That's like, of course they can. The other thing is the inspections for them are too slow. And the other one is that they seem arbitrary. So I think, and this would be in terms of enforcement, I agree too, because I had some properties, I had to bother the city. Please, can you get these people out because my tenants are afraid. These people next door. So I think having a very set, in other words, if they're the things that you inspect, there should be a clear list. This is what we inspect, and they're related to the codes, they're related to safety, they're related to all these things, and everybody knows the rules, So I think that would help Section 8. Because the fastest way you can get housing is to have more people accept Section 8. Now, there's a lot of investors, which are true, they have a lot more than 30% burden. Some of them are 50 or 60%. So they're struggling just to keep their units filled. So the other bigger issue that I think some people are aware of is that there's a lot of houses that are coming into foreclosure, and who's buying those? About 40% of the properties that are being purchased in foreclosure are bought by hedge funds. So if you have $400 million, I mean, it's easy to buy properties. You can buy them like all day long, but they're not fixed up easily. There's no quick way to actually fix them up. And so I think there has to be some sort of restrictions. I mean, I've lost all kinds of properties because they bid twice as what I can afford to pay. So it's like, and some of those actually I bid on 2 years ago are still empty. And so that's what's happening on their books. On their balance sheet of the company, they got an asset that's worth in money. Will it appreciate in 3 to 5 years? 100%. So their risk is like, they're good. They're not concerned about exactly when it'll be fixed up. They'll eventually get to it. But when you have 40% of the properties like that, that's a big problem. So maybe it's a Susan Wild problem and a bigger issue, but that's a real issue. Those are taken off the market. And whether if you're in the private sector, it's a problem because these people have a lot more money than you. And they don't have any incentive to get it cash flowing right away. If you buy a property yourself, like what Jonathan does, you're not going to wait 2 years to get it on the market. No, absolutely not. So I think having education about Section 8 and contractors, I think it's a great idea. And then enforcement, I just think it needs to be consistent. I as an investor, I want to fix up my property. I want to keep them safe because it's my investment, And also, I think that the idea of actually, if we want to get money, I think if you actually needed to raise some money, increasing the transfer tax, as long as it went into land banks and something that they use. I mean, I have investors that complain about, the school taxes. I said, but you want to be in the best school district, don't you? Of course they do, because that's where the appreciation will be. So I said, then you shouldn't complain about the taxes so much. But I think actually that 1% or, you pay 2%, if that went into land banks and if that went into things that the investors, they don't know how to use it, they don't understand it, but if they did, and it wouldn't kill a deal. Like if it was 1% more of the transfer tax, that probably wouldn't kill any of your deals, would it, Jonathan?
Yeah, some people aren't going to like me for saying this, but I'm not here to be liked. Increasing the transfer tax, I think, is actually a great tool. It shouldn't be egregious or something that prevents transactions from happening. But in the same token, that money should be specifically utilized for a purpose that, is originally set out to accomplish, not deviating and it goes into a general budget. And then before you know it, we don't know where the money's at. So I think that if that is ever tapped into in the local municipalities, it needs to specifically be used for housing. It's a topic that the Realtors Association doesn't want to discuss because it could be harmful to business. But I think, we own properties in Reading, Pennsylvania. Reading, Pennsylvania's transfer tax is 5%. It didn't stop us from, going in and out. So I think that, it's something that we seriously need to consider. When you look at all of the programs that have been rolled out to help affordable housing, public housing came out in 1937. The tax credit or Section 8 housing assistance payment contracts and choice vouchers came out in 1974. The tax credit program came out in 86. We have gone a significant amount of time without a really major shift. And not that the transfer tax is that, but it's something that I think is tangible and it could be implemented immediately. So, I'm a fan of it, and I just think it needs to be done in a way where it doesn't hurt any individual or party.
Well, the Realtor Association was invoked, so
Yes.
I would say.
Robert, you're in favor of it, so we'll take the endorsement right now.
I would just say that of course, that's an investment perspective, right? Because a lot of times we got to understand that investors write off costs, right? Those things are often passed on to the consumer. You're an investor, John, you're an investor. At the end of the day, you understand the business, the economics of making an investment and then passing on any extended costs to others. We can talk about correlation between transfer taxes and what that does for a community. It's not in opposition to the use of funds for the purpose of affordable housing. What it is an opposition to blanket raising without any plan. And I think you said that very well. In your talk earlier, your keynote, you addressed it. If we don't have a plan associated with what we're going to do with those funds, then that's what we're opposing. See, it's one thing to say, let's increase it with the goal of increasing affordable housing and making that the ballot question. It's another to just simply remove it with ambiguity and not necessarily say, here's the plan ultimately what we're doing and up to what limit. Because Reading is 5%, right? Who's moving, right? What's the housing stock down in Reading? What's the valuation in Reading, right? What's the property values in Reading? But that's the truth. So just to throw that out there, there's an investment way of looking at things, and there's certainly an owner-occupier way of looking at things. And so we have to balance both. It's the difference between market rate and understanding affordable housing. Market rate and affordable housing has two different tracks of conversation, right? So that's all. Sorry, Asher, go ahead.
I just want to say from a lending standpoint, increasing costs for home buyers is, they're already dealing with everything from the NAR settlement and possibly having to pay realtor commissions there. Obviously the home prices in general, interest rates are starting to go down, but obviously still higher than what we've been used to over the last several years. So we just have to keep that in mind too, that you're going to, by increasing those types of costs, you're going to cut a lot of people out of the market to purchase as well.
If I could, I agree with that. My concern is about the first-time home buyer that is going to be restricted. We're working on a first-time home buyer savings account that we haven't been able to get done yet, but that's something that we're trying to reduce costs, not increase. I think it's like 40 or 50% of the transactions in the city of Allentown are by LLCs. I want to increase home ownership, and to increase costs for first-time home buyers is kind of going the opposite direction. So obviously, to your point, if you can strategically invest in property value increasing programs like blight remediation and affordable housing, it's a different story. But I think the way that referendum in Allentown's written right now, it doesn't do that. And so I think it's just kind of an easy grab for revenue. But if you could target it, it's a different story.
Asher, before you go, we have a couple questions left, but we're just going to wind up skipping them so we can move on to kind of a question and answer portion. But I think
I need to head out.
And Nick's got a bail, so
thank you, Representative.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
So I think what we got to the heart of is, though, at the end of the day, the public sector's real job is to sort of kind of set the playing field and create the foundation where the private sector can thrive. And I think that's sort of what we're talking about. Certainty of enforcement, make sure that everybody plays on a level playing field. And I agree with you when it comes to strategic investments of housing dollars, because I do think at the end of the day, the way that cities like Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton have thrived is because good actors in the private sector have seen the value of investing, but they only want to play by the rules when you create a rule, rules worth playing by. And if you feel like so many bad actors are rewarded for poor behavior, you don't get that corresponding collective investment. So I agree with you, Jonathan. I think, there has to be a certainty of punishment. Otherwise, you're not going to have a personal or self-interest incentive to do the right thing. I agree. The majority of folks abide. I think a great deal of landlords abide by the law because they have to, not because they really want to. If they could cut corners and cut codes, they probably would. It's only the fact that the city is going to come down on them with a hammer that they actually do the right thing. And I don't care why they do the right thing. I just want them to do it. And I share the same sentiment. I believe that the way that the RTT was put forward in Allentown was poorly conceived and ill thought. But I do believe the job of the public sector is to make strategic and tactical investments that capacitate private sector investment. And I think that's what the NIS was intended to do, right? Was public dollars to draw private sector investment downtown. And that would magnetize and leverage additional private dollars that didn't need public subsidy. And you're starting to see that kind of happen on the outskirts of the NIS now as private developers see the value of being in proximity to that. I think the RTT could be that for Allentown if those dollars were dedicated towards blight remediation. Maybe a certain amount of that money is set aside for first-time home buyers in Allentown to offset the effects associated with the RTT. But it all comes down, and the devil's always in the details. So I know, Asher, you wanted to say something, and we're going to open it up to questions. And hopefully I haven't botched my job as moderator. So
just briefly, because I know that we're whining and people are walking out, obviously, but the Realtor Association was mentioned. I wasn't planning on talking this morning. I was just here to listen, but Sam's absolutely correct. Senator Miller, a lot of other folks have hit on it, but we're not opposed to putting things out for referendum. I think our Government Affairs Committee, we had Allentown City Council members in, and if it was tied to something affordable housing, I think we'd be willing to listen. But again, we're not in favor of increasing the tax, saying, hey, we're going to raise this money. We'll tell you later what it's for. So we're against that, as well as being completely transparent with voters that, hey, the question is, do you want to remove the transfer tax, which sounds like a tax break. You're getting rid of the tax. But what you're really doing is removing it from the charter so that city council and the mayor can go ahead and propose an increase. So again, we're not opposed to things going to voters. We're not opposed to voters deciding things, but we want it to be transparent. We want there to be a plan to spend the money that's raised, which currently there is not. So we'll be running a very public campaign to inform voters of what exactly they're voting for.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Hi, Lori Swensky. I'm with Turning Point of Lehigh Valley, and interesting discussion. We yesterday got notice that through some fair funds, United Way is going to be able to give us landlord incentive dollars, which is great because even with a team of 4 advocates hustling to find rental units for people, we struggle. Again, a lot of what you talk about, we don't typically have Section 8 clients. What we typically do have is up to 2 years of rental assistance. And a lot of mom and pops, we call, we find great units, and the communities even outside of the cities, and they're afraid of the subsidized housing. And I come from mom and pop entrepreneurs, my family, I get it. They typically have not wanted to rent or sell to people with VA funding or any of those types of services. So I guess I'm wondering, as we talk about tax breaks and all of the LIHTCs and the overly complicated things, has there been consideration of tax breaks for private landlords or anything like that to rent to people with subsidies? Is that built into any of the legislation that's pending?
It's not that targeted. I think the vast majority of the legislation that we've worked on in Harrisburg is just broadly about affordability. It's not necessarily dedicated to, a particular, affordable for folks escaping a certain situation.
Well, not for just
Yeah.
my clients. I'm talking about in general. I mean, we're part of all these landlord incentive groups, right? But there's still this general fear. And I love the education component. I absolutely agree. Most don't care. But would they show up maybe if they got a certain tax break? Would they be able to talk to us if we said, look, you get some sort of subsidy from us, from Veterans Affairs, from any other group? We ask you to do an hour of education a year, whatever it is, and in exchange, you get a tax write-off. I think that's how you get certain people to the table. Again, agree, some people need to be there through enforcement, but when we're talking about carrots and we talk about the incentives for the big players through grants and federal subsidies for LIHTCs and everything, looking at how do we gear to the mom and pops might also get away from some of, incentivize people to want to keep their rental properties and not sell off to the hedge funds. So just something to kind of throw out there from our experience.
Yeah, well, I think that speaks to the need of creating, a sufficient and robust amount of state resources that we can direct towards those smaller landlords. So perhaps if you do accept, a housing choice voucher, you get first dibs or you get your first in line for housing rehabilitation dollars to try to, set the playing field up so that we are incentivizing more mom and pop landlords to realize that, it's the carrot is probably some sort of preferential treatment when it comes to you get extra points on your application or you're a little bit more likely to receive local dollars associated with rehabbing your property. I think, there's nothing at the state level in that sense, but I think there's an opportunity maybe even for local creativity to sort of leverage local grant dollars. $10,000 for a mom and pop landlord is a big deal if it means they're going to put it towards, renovating, maybe the HVAC system or whatever.
Well, I also, just to your point, I get those calls all the time. Do you have any units, from Turning Point, other organizations that call? And the education is so important because many of the landlords, there is a stigma. I don't care. That's why they changed it from Section 8 to House Choice Voucher Program. Think about it. We're just repackaging something, but everybody knows what it is. It's Section 8. We still call it Section 8, all right? If you're old enough to remember Section 8, I'm from New York City, originally from the Bronx. Everybody knows what Section 8 is, right? At the end of the day, I lived in a housing project. I know what it's like. So what I would say to you is, again, it's removing that stigma. So I think another avenue here for the representative would be, maybe a break, some kind of business privilege tax break if they accept a housing choice voucher, because we do have to pay business privilege tax, or you get a $50 reduction in your permit for the year if you accept Section 8. It could be done at the local level. I think state level, maybe the Department of Revenue could offer an incentive. You prove for the year that you had an HCV client, then you get a percentage back or you get a rebate back, similar to we do to green energy solutions, right? If you put solar panels on your house, what do? You apply for it, you put it in on your, in your income tax or your taxes every year, and there's some kind of incentive for that back. Maybe that could be done at the state level, but it is hard. And because, as a broker, I try to explain housing choice voucher, the investment part of it. I try to talk the language of the investor. That's the problem. We don't talk to them in the language they understand. We talk to them about all the nice, and this is good for the community. You got to talk to them about how the investors look at things. It's stability, long-term payment, screening. You have an abundance of potential tenants, right? If you accept. But we don't talk that way, unfortunately, to landlords. We tend to talk to them about all the reasons why they should do it instead of telling them in the language in which they speak, which is, it's a great investment vehicle for you if that's something you want to do. And that's what I see very frequently.
Sam, you hit the nail on the head with all of those points from an investor standpoint. I think something else that if we could change the stigma in this way, it would help. But if investors started to look at that voucher amount as tenant income, because these tenants can still be denied based on lack of income, you roll that voucher amount into it as income, and it starts to be harder and harder to deny them based on income. So I think that's one way to look at it that might be beneficial long term.
Hi, Carissa from Bethlehem Health Bureau. So I actually have like a handful of landlords that I reach out to, for referrals for the community. And I had one about 3 weeks ago he owns 22 properties. Most of them are multi-unit properties. And he's thinking about pulling out of the housing choice voucher because there's inconsistencies in payment where there's been times where he's waiting up to 3 months to even get that payment. Is there any work being done to improve the operations for those who are already participants in the program?
Well, it's the housing authority that's paying the subsidy. So which housing authority do you think they're dealing? Easton. Okay, so it's Easton or Northampton housing authority. So the first thing would be to find out what the problem is there, and if they'll give you information. But then you can also contact our HUD's Office of Public Housing, as they monitor all the housing authorities. So I knew that was a problem in Philadelphia, but I didn't think it was a problem in some of the smaller housing authorities. So they need to know that that's an issue because they look at utilization rates all the time. And if that's the issue, and was this the first payment or all of the payments?
He has multiple properties, so like you said, it's inconsistent. So it won't just be for the one unit that he's missing payments for,
Right.
and he's been doing it for years.
Okay.
So now he's thinking about pulling out, which is a huge hit for Easton.
Yes. Yeah. So you can just call the main number for our office, and you can ask for Office of Public Housing.
Question here. I guess I have the mic back here. A question, I guess, for Jonathan. The investors that you attract, are they, when the returns are looking for, are they kind of in the business of affordable housing in that, or are they kind of agnostic to that and they just looking for basically a return commensurate with the risk? Like, is that important to, kind of the mission that you're attracting or otherwise?
So all the capital that we use is our own capital. So we don't raise capital with investors. But what I would say, just based on knowing the capital markets, there are specific funds out there that they raise capital around folks that want to make social impact. So that money is out there, and I don't want to say it's a surplus, but it's accessible for folks that want to raise capital. I think at the end of the day, the large majority of folks investing want to have a positive social impact, but it's just math. And it's no more complicated than just arithmetic. So at the end of the day, it's just, what is my return and how do I get the greatest return? So I think, yes, there is, especially since COVID, there has been a tremendous amount more socially conscious capital out there, requiring a lot of these larger hedge funds or private equity funds to have that type of capital might be something that would be positive. Just like banks are required to participate in CRA. But the capital is out there, but at the end of the day, it really just comes down to the return. I think everyone, it's human nature to just be a little selfish and worry about, at the end of the day, what is my return?
So I'm going to jump in real quick. We have time for about 3 more questions. So if anybody else wants to ask a question of the panel, please raise your hand and myself or David will be around. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Diane Elliott. I have a nonprofit where I work with folks who have been through the criminal justice system. We've gotten them back on their feet. We've gotten them good jobs. They're valued employees, and they can't get a place to live because of their criminal record. Yeah. But it doesn't matter that they've turned their lives around and they're giving back to the community. They're working at some of the nonprofits. They're valued employees. They're some of the best employees some of these folks have. And in the end, they're being told that even if you do everything right, you're still not going to have a place to live. So that's part of your affordable housing issue. How do we address that?
There's been a lot of more work on reentry than there used to be. Our office has looked at with the Justice Department, looked at the fair housing component because it could be considered a certain type of discrimination. And not that people with that we call justice involved they're not a protected class, but it has the effect because there's more minorities who have become in the criminal justice system partly because of discrimination. So the effect may be that they're more likely not to get housing. So there's a lot more views of talking with landlords about their screening criteria, mostly based on things like how long has it been since they have this, how does their screening criteria say that they would do a criminal background check and how many years it'll go back? So that's one of those kinds of negotiating factors of if it's 5 years versus 20 years or no year listed. So there's a lot more work to be done on it. I don't have an immediate answer for you, but that's there are a lot of groups working on it now.
So I would say, as being a practitioner, dealing with it, I would say most of the screening processes are not uniformed. I think the challenge, it goes back to education, right? What's the policy? I'm working with a manufactured home park, which has a screening mechanism because you buy the unit, you rent the land, which is an option, you know, other than tiny homes. Manufactured housing has come a long way. It would be a great opportunity if we were to buy land and put these units, because they do meet the single level requirement. But the biggest challenge I run into, and this is in education, because I actually taught these landlords, first time, you know, mobile home park, you know, manufactured home park owners, they need to have policies. What's your policy when you decline somebody? What's your policy on screening? What is your Fair Credit Reporting Act criteria? When you deny somebody based on credit, you're required to tell them what you denied them for, as well as the source of information where you got it, right? And you give them an opportunity. You send them the letter. You say, here's why you were denied. It was because of your credit. And there's several check boxes which our Realtor Association provides. And they pick the criteria that they were denied for, but gives them the information, said Equifax came back with this information. Here's their address. Go reach out to them. Do you know how many landlords decline people without providing that FCRA report? Do you know how many landlords decline somebody without explaining? You can look at some of the Facebook report posts where they don't even know whether they're accepted or declined. The landlord just never called them back, and they found out the unit was rented to someone else, but never got a judgment or a declination letter as to why. So from an enforcement perspective, maybe that's something that, you know, we can, from government perspective, say, no, there has to be a standardized criteria for screening. Here's the Fair Credit Reporting Act rules. Here's the, you know, whatever criminal justice. This is when you decline somebody, here's what it is. But the problem is with most rentals in the valley and beyond the valley, it's not, I'm licensed in Florida as well. I would say it's a lack of uniform standards of declining. There is no criteria. Many times the landlords take it, and it could be fair housing. That's the problem, is that without policy, you open yourself up to litigation. One of the reasons why most real estate companies don't enter into property management as a vocation, meaning some companies don't offer it at all, is because of the legal liability associated with renting. So what you're having here, and the liability is they're running without policies, they're making decisions without facts. And so unfortunately, if we don't educate the landlords, again, I go back to my new landlord orientation, maybe part of that orientation is the home choice voucher program, or what do you do with somebody who's reentry, right? So that's a national issue. I'll be honest with you. It's not localized. That's something that we see across the board in many of the states that we operate in. And of course, we advocate for it as an association for uniform standards for criteria. Many reasons why landlords don't list with realtors is because we must abide by the law when it comes to housing. That's the reason why when you contact a realtor, many times we don't have housing for rent. And it's because the inventory we have is not sufficient. Well, it's because you can go to apartments.com and list it yourself. Right. So the truth is by listing with us, we have to abide by the law. So some landlords generally, you know, will not list with us because of the legal requirements that we're going to have as realtors, as licensees in the state, that we cannot discriminate. We cannot just decline somebody. We have to give a response. If you don't want this applicant, we need to give them a reason why. And so that's some of the challenge we've run into. I think that's a legislative, maybe something for the legislative to work on, but I think it's a national problem. It's not unique to the Valley. It is something that we see across the board. It's just lack of uniformity and standards when it comes to this stuff.
And I'll just mention that there are requirements, if it's subsidized housing or housing choice voucher, that there has to be an appeal hearing. But if it's market rate and you can still ask for an appeal. They might not have to give it to you, but if you ask for an appeal hearing, at least that gives the opportunity for that person to say, well, this is my situation. And also some people come in at the beginning in the application process and they reveal what their situation was. And sometimes that works well too.
Good question back here.
Hi, my name is Pam Lambert. I'm a housing case manager for the County of Lehigh. So I work on a micro level with people who are on limited incomes and need affordable housing. I've come here today to learn more about the meso and macro level behind affordable housing. But there's something I'd just like to share with people who do work on that level. There's been talk here about housing choice vouchers, and there was a little small mention of VASH, which are actual vouchers and work in different ways from some of the programs I help run, which are permanent supportive housing. So I'd just like to throw out to landlords here, or people who are working with landlords, that not all housing assistance is the same. The program I work with provides a supportive piece, which means that people coming into this program have a case manager. someone there keeping an eye on them, someone there to support them if they run into problems, to walk them through any snags that might happen during their rentals, to advocate for them, but also to work with landlords, help put things in perspective. So when you have someone who has housing assistance, I encourage you to ask, what type of housing assistance is it? Housing choice vouchers are completely independent. They do not require a case manager. Permanent supportive housing does. So for instance, two programs that I help run are something called Shelter Plus Care, which is funded by HUD, and another program called Permanent Supportive Housing. Both of these are through Lehigh County Housing Authority. When I have people in my programs who want to move or need to move, I encourage them to develop a list of talking points they can use with landlords. And one of the biggest things they have to offer you if you're a landlord is the fact that they tend to stay in their housing for over 8 years. They do not have a voucher that they have to stay in your place for 1 year before they can take somewhere else. They want to stay with you. They want to work with you. They have to pass a housing inspection just like you do. It's on them as well. If they don't take care of their property, they can't continue in the program. They can't have unapproved people living with them. They have incentives themselves to be good tenants, and many of them are. So we did talk about stigma. I'm asking you to think about the fact that some people are unfairly stigmatized when we group housing assistance together. So that's really all I wanted to say, not really ask a question, but just share a little bit of my perspective in the work that I do.
Well, I would just throw out there that anybody's just like that information could share it with us, share it with our association. Explain that because we're the largest, obviously one of the largest trade groups in the area. Share it with the Lehigh Valley Realtor Association. So any pamphlets, any information, just educating, that could be something we bring back to our education committee and learn a little bit more about these options as we do interact with landlords. But I would say bring that information to us so then we can disseminate with the interactions of landlords and owners that we communicate with. So that's the collaboration, right? Private partnership. So that's one of the things I would say, bring it to us, bring it to our attention. Let us help get that information out for you since we're on the ground with landlords and tenants. So it'd be
Great.
something to help out, okay?
Well, Lynn, let me ask you, I don't have that type of brochures, and I don't think the housing authority I work with has them either. Does HUD have any information that's available to share about permanent supportive housing? Okay, I'll look into that. And how would I share this? Who would I get it to? Wonderful. Thank you.
And perhaps that's something that out of this summit that we can put on a task list of getting that consolidated material and education out to all of the partners.
Hi, I work at a state representative's office here in Bethlehem, and I feel like the Lorax, I speak for the trees. I speak for the seniors and disabled that call our office and have issues. And the biggest thing that we see with housing, affordable housing with seniors and the disabled is that they get onto a housing list because they can't afford to be where they are. And they have to wait for 2 years, sometimes longer. By the time their number finally comes up, they have like spent more money than they can afford to try to stay where they are until their number comes up. Their number comes up, they run a credit report, and they fail the credit report. They don't know where to turn from there. They can appeal, sure, but if their credit is bad because they've tried to live beyond their means until they get to the next step, there should be a next step in that process that if they fail the appeal, if the credit really is bad, can they be hooked up with a caseworker who could then help them to repair that credit and give them another opportunity, maybe put them on a 6-month or a 12-month plan to improve that credit rating so that they can get into those units that they've waited 2 years to get into? Just a question.
I'll just say quickly to that HUD has a whole list of housing counseling agencies that are generally free. um, and they can help repair credit. I do empathize with the idea that the person has to wait so long on the waiting list, and you said 2 years, and in Philadelphia, it's like 15. So, but it all comes back to that there's not enough. You know, we're trying to get more affordable housing. Again, if it's a HUD subsidized building, for example, then they have the ability to have an appeal hearing. And so they could explain that particular situation at their appeal hearing and see what that third party person decides.
That their credit is not something that they're willing to overlook, that it has to be repaired. Can they be automatically enrolled into a program, or are they counseled about those credit counseling programs at that appeal hearing? Or is that something they have to seek out on their own?
They probably aren't counseled at those hearings, but those hearings are a different person than the one that rejected them in the first place. And they can take all kinds of things into consideration. It depends what they want to. But I would suggest that a lot of the people who are struggling before their name comes up should go to our free housing counseling now. They may have suggestions that are going to help them not get bad credit, even if they don't have the funds. I know that's difficult, but some of these counseling agencies do have some very good suggestions.
Okay, this is going to be our final question of the day. And Sarah, if you need to go, because I think you're on a time limit as well, please feel free to go.
Hi, my name is Mirella Snow. I am a representative from the Bethlehem Housing Authority, and I am the resident selection supervisor for public housing and Section 8. We don't do any credit. You know, we know that our applicants are low income. So they're coming to see us, they do their application on our waiting list because they don't have the money. Their credit isn't great, so we don't really care about that. We care, though, about the criminal history. We screen them properly. Now HUD says to us that it's only 3 years if it's a criminal about drugs, drug-related offense. Other than that, we allow them to come into our programs. For the Section 8, I'm also the manager of the Section 8 department, and unfortunately, we don't have funds to do incentives to the landlords. Our funding is very, very limited. Lynn could attest to that. So we would like to work with, partnership agencies here to help us to get, as Sam said, landlords education, and to have, incentives for more property owners to become landlords in the Section 8 program. We do our best, we help as much as we can, but sometimes it's out of our control. Another thing that I want to add, I see, because I came to another summit, the one in June, and I hear a lot about Section 8, and unfortunately, Section 8 is not the answer alone by itself to affordable housing. We need to do a lot of other things. So, helping each other, that's going to create more affordable housing for all our, individuals in the city of Bethlehem and in the Lehigh Valley in general. Thank you.
Thank you, and a special thank you to our panelists today for joining us. We appreciate the time and feedback that you've given on this topic. So our next summit is going to be Tuesday, December 10th, same time, same place. And so this time when we send out the follow-up email, we are going to be including a feedback survey because we'd really like to get an understanding from the people who have attended what format you have liked the most so that we know how to structure the December one. And we're also going to inquire on your thoughts on continuing this into 2025. When we originally started this planning process, we were only going to do 4 sessions, but clearly this isn't an issue that you can solve in 1 year. So we want to get feedback on how we're doing and if we should continue and all those thoughts from you all. So that will be included in the feedback email that I send out to everybody in attendance. So thank you all for being here. We truly appreciate the time and input that everybody has provided.